A wave of shock, ecstasy, and sharp, agonizing guilt washed over me. I was overwhelmed by the miracle of life and the crushing weight of my absence. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I demanded, my voice cracking with emotion. I couldn't fathom why they had hidden this for 5 months. My son was growing, and I had been a fool, completely unaware. The Count remained unmoved, his expression one of detached insight. Count Rockefort leaned back, his gaze sharp. This was Charlotte's decision, he stated calmly. I was stunned. The situation was clear, the Count continued. You had just received the imperial marriage decree to wed Princess Louise. With the eyes of the northern frontier and the kingdom upon you, Charlotte feared that knowing about the pregnancy would cause you to act irrationally, risking exposure. That would have been catastrophic for her, the child, you, and the entire Rockefort family. I opened my mouth, but no words came. I knew the Count was right. Had I known then, my despair might have driven me to openly defy the decree. That would have dragged everyone into the abyss. The Count observed my shifting expression, then asked coldly, even if you had known, what would have changed? He leaned forward. Could you truly have remained steadfast, keeping your distance from Princess Louise while maintaining your composure? Could you have resisted that red line? My throat tightened. The Count's words cut through my self-deception. Only days ago, in the princess's tent, I had nearly lost control. I realized my resolve was fragile. The Count's question left me unable to answer. Could I guarantee that political pressure and proximity to the princess wouldn't have led me to betray Charlotte and our unborn child? I couldn't. This self-doubt was more agonizing than any external blame. My resentment over being kept in the dark was replaced by crushing guilt. Guilt not just for Charlotte, but for the child I had never met. Charlotte had endured the pains of pregnancy and childbirth alone, all while shielding me from the truth to protect my future. Meanwhile, I had remained ignorant, nearly committing an unforgivable act. Thinking of the princess's bite mark on my shoulder and Charlotte raising our son alone in Hewingham, I was overcome with self-loathing. Did I deserve to be a father? Did I deserve Charlotte's sacrifice? The Count watched as my face cycled through shock, doubt, and profound agony. He waited in silence, letting the weight of the revelation sink in. The office was silent, save for my ragged breathing. I bowed my head, my hands clenching and unclenching. Looking up, my eyes filled with longing. Count, how is Charlotte? Are she and the child well? Count Rockefort lit his pipe, the smoke obscuring his face. He looked toward the gray sky of France City. Count Boris von Herix has appointed her commander of the Rhineland Legion to train new recruits and suppress the rebels in Hewingham. Commander, I repeated, my face pale with bitter realization. This was the true Charlotte, the brilliant commander I had fought alongside in the north. She was never a delicate flower needing rescue. Even through the trials of motherhood, she stood tall, sword in hand, protecting what she cherished. She was like the Edelweiss of the north, resilient and radiant. Her brilliance only highlighted my own weakness and near betrayal. I felt suffocated by my own inadequacy. I understand, I whispered, standing up. Thank you for telling me. I must go. I will handle my situation with the princess. I will ensure Charlotte and the child have a peaceful life in Confort. I will bring her and Klein to Confort. That is where our home is. I only hope that she might one day forgive me. I turned and walked toward the castle gate, my silhouette thin and desolate. As I reached the archway, the Count's voice boomed behind him. Carl. I paused without turning. Remember, Klein is your son, and Charlotte is his mother. From now on, think of them before you act. You, Carl von Schmidt, no longer live for yourself alone. My fingers trembled on the door handle. The cold metal stung, but the weight of the Count's warning was heavier. I stood like a frozen statue for several seconds, then gave a slow, heavy nod. I know, Count, I said, my voice raspy. I will remember. I pulled the heavy door open and stepped out of the suffocating office. The door closed with a dull thud, sealing away the warmth of the fire and my future father-in-law. I felt no relief, only the transition from one prison to another, the prison of reality. The echo of Klein is your son pierced me like needles. I leaned against the cold stone wall in the dim corridor. The chill of the stone cooled my fevered mind. I struggled to process the truth. I had a son, a living child, born of my blood and Charlotte's. a child who was growing, perhaps even learning to reach out, while I had been oblivious and on the verge of betrayal. The shame was nauseating. Finally, I gathered my strength and moved forward. I walked out of the castle like a sleepwalker, traversing the familiar corridor lined with ancient tapestries and dim lamps. I responded to the salutes of guards and servants with hollow, unfocused eyes, barely registering their presence. Their polite greetings and worried gazes felt distant, as if filtered through thick frosted glass. I moved mechanically while my mind raced uncontrollably. I obsessed over Charlotte's pregnancy, the pain of her labor, and whether our child, Klein, resembled me. Was the boy sturdy? Did he cry? I wondered how Charlotte endured those lonely, anxious nights, and if she resented me as an absent father and unfaithful lover. Every imagined detail cut at my heart like a dull blade. Guilt, self-reproach, and a sudden, overwhelming surge of fatherly love formed a torrent of agony that threatened to drown me. I realized my behavior over the past months was not merely emotional wavering, but a betrayal of life and duty. A desperate need to make amends took root, acting as a beacon in my darkness, though it brought only deeper fear and confusion. How could I redeem myself? How could I face Charlotte, justify my worthiness, or handle Louise, the Queen Mother, and the royal family? How could I protect them all in this chaotic, perilous world? Overwhelmed, I leaned against a cold stained glass window, the shifting light reflecting my inner turmoil. Yet, all these burdens were now overshadowed by a more concrete, tender reality: Klein and Charlotte. I was no longer living for myself alone. The heavy wooden door closed behind me, shutting out the cold light and my retreating figure. Count Rochefort watched me, his gaze piercing the door to follow the young lord, now burdened by the weight of sudden fatherhood. He walked to the window, observing the France City reinforcements preparing to march. Soldiers moved like ants beneath fluttering banners. He would soon lead them against the northern wolves. The Count's sharp eyes had caught every flicker of shock, guilt, and self-loathing on my face. Good. The Count's tension eased. My fear of losing Charlotte and the child proved I was still salvageable. It showed that Charlotte still held enough weight to shake my ambition-driven heart. The child, Klein, acted as a heavy weight on the scales of my life, making it impossible for me to maintain my self-deceptive balance. The Count did not want a total rupture between them, and not just because of their shared bloodline. Little Klein was the future of the Rochefort family and the ultimate tether to bind me to their cause. More importantly, it touched a hidden, painful corner of the Count's own heart. He recalled his own youth, his ambitious self, and his proud, stubborn wife. They, too, had once shared passionate love and dreams for the future. Yet, power, ambition, and temptation eventually led to suspicion, cold wars, and resentment that devoured their happiness. They eventually drifted apart, maintaining a facade of peace while their inner lives turned into frozen tombs. He still tasted the bitterness of that estrangement, where the closest person becomes a stranger. He refused to let his daughter, Charlotte, repeat that tragedy. He did not want her living in a cold, ornate tomb with a husband who shared her bed but not her soul. He wanted Charlotte to find true happiness, love, and mutual respect. He wanted her to enter her new life with joy, not the hollow shell of duty and interest that defined his own marriage. For this, I had to commit my body and soul entirely to Charlotte and Klein. I could no longer waver or hesitate. I had to sever all dangerous ties, emotional and physical, with the Plantagenet princess. I had to become a true husband and father, not just a political partner. The path is laid out, boy, the Count whispered to the leaden sky, his voice hard yet tinged with paternal exhaustion. How you walk it is up to you. Don't disappoint me, or Charlotte, and don't let that little one grow up in a broken home. 2 days later, at the training grounds outside France City, a leaden, winter sky hung low over the city, casting a grim, icy atmosphere. Despite the cold, the city was alive with a mix of anticipation, anxiety, and grim resolve. The grounds were a sea of steel and banners. The Rochefort red gold lion, the Carnford spruce, and various noble flags snapped in the wind. Nearly 20,000 soldiers stood in disciplined formations. Infantry spears formed a forest of steel, cavalry horses puffed white breath into the air, and supply wagons sat like dormant snakes behind the lines. This was the full mobile strength of the Rockefort territory, made possible by the security of the Francairnford fortress chain. Though their gear was polished, the soldiers' faces betrayed fatigue and fear. They knew the march to Eagleness to face the Solon main force would be a bloody affair. My 3,000 Carnford troops had arrived yesterday and were positioned on the right flank. A deep, resonant horn blast silenced the crowd. The training ground fell deathly silent, save for the howling wind and snapping flags. Count Rockefort, clad in black plate armor with gold trim and a crimson cloak, strode onto the platform with his guards. Bareheaded, his face like carved stone, he scanned the army with cold, piercing eyes that forced every soldier to stand straighter. Behind him stood I, key commanders, and a nervous royal envoy wiping sweat from his brow. The count's gaze lingered on me for a moment, calm and indifferent, as if our recent private conversation had never occurred. I nodded, expressionless. The air between us felt colder than the winter wind. Soldiers, the count's voice cut through the wind with strange clarity. The Solon wolves have broken faith, trampled our lands, and besieged Eagleness. Their crimes demand retribution. Count Rockefort raised his voice, metallic and resolute. In the name of the king and the queen mother, I lead you north to lift the siege of Eagle's Nest, save the people, and restore peace. We shall carve a path to victory for the Plantagenet. Kill! 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 Tens of thousands of soldiers roared, their thunderous voices shaking the city walls. Blades were drawn and spears struck the ground, the metallic clamor merging into a singular, powerful force. Fran City's residents crowded the walls and streets, waving rags and hats, shouting, "Long live the Count! Beat the Solonians! Victory to the heroes!" The crowd clamored, the city emptying into the streets. The wave of sound, fueled by patriotism and a desperate hope for survival, washed over the departing troops. Soldiers, blood boiling, raised their weapons higher, their roars growing hoarse. Individual fear was swallowed by collective fervor, honor and duty were magnified. Yet, two men remained detached amidst the frenzy. Count Rockefort struck his breastplate, acknowledging the crowd, which triggered even louder cheers. Deep in his eyes, however, lay an icy stillness. He needed this grand spectacle not just for morale, but to show the royal capital and the world his loyalty. His family was doing their duty, but the speed of their march was a different matter. These 20,000 men were his bargaining chips for the post-war northern frontier. They had to reach Eagle's Nest intact and be used judiciously. I stood silently, my black eyes scanning the crowd, the Count's profile, and the hopeful faces on the walls. I felt no passion, only cold calculation and heavy responsibility. The performance was a success, binding individual fates to the collective war machine, but I wondered, would it lead to glory or the abyss? How long could Eisenberg hold? Would Harold set an ambush? I caught the eyes of Roland and Leon. The Carnford troops were my true reliance. The 2-hour ceremony ended, and by tradition, the army should have marched immediately. "Count," the royal envoy urged, his smile stiff. "Eagle's Nest is in peril. Eisenberg sends desperate reports. Should we not march at full speed?" Rockefort stroked his beard with feigned contemplation. The envoy is right, but... He gestured to the exhausted soldiers and the unorganized logistics train. They have traveled all night. The supplies are not yet checked. A hasty night march could lead to chaos or ambush. Let them rest and eat. We depart at dawn, fully prepared to relieve Eagle's Nest. "But Count," the envoy protested. "Speed is everything. If we delay, Eagle's Nest might fall." Rockefort's voice turned cold, his icy blue eyes cutting through the envoy. "I have commanded for decades. Do I not know the value of speed? But a general must weigh victory against defeat. I will not lead my men into a trap out of impatience. If we are ambushed due to fatigue, who bears the responsibility? You or I?" The cold, authoritative snort left the envoy trembling and silent. He looked to me for support. I bowed slightly to the Count, my voice calm. "The Count's caution is wise. The Carnford troops need to check their gear and feed the horses. Dawn is the appropriate time to depart." The envoy's face fell. He cursed the two warlords silently. He realized that in the northern frontier, His title as royal envoy meant nothing. To the envoy's despair, the loyalist army set up camp. They cooked, organized gear, and inspected horses with deliberate, steady pacing. By dawn the next day, the army finally moved, the massive legion stirring like a waking beast. Scouts fanned out, cavalry guarded the flanks, and the infantry marched, the supply wagons groaning under the dust. Yet, the pace was agonizingly slow. Order. Slow the vanguard. Maintain formation. Keep the supply wagons steady. Rear guard. Collect the stragglers. The army moved as if in slow motion, covering little ground. At this rate, they would take twice as long as necessary to reach Eagle's Nest. The envoy watched, frantic as an ant on a hot pan, but helpless. His pleas for speed were repeatedly rebuffed by the Count's excuses of preserving strength and avoiding ambushes. He even approached me, urging me to prioritize royal interests. I replied coldly, "The Count is experienced. We are new to this terrain. Caution is prudent. Greed for speed leads to traps. Besides," I added, looking north, "Eisenberg has a strong fortress and ample supplies. He can hold for months. The Solonians are far from home and need a quick victory. Our steady approach will find the right moment to strike." The envoy was left speechless and retreated in frustration. Late November, year 1 of Sigmund, Ferran Bridgehead, Brittany Province. The northwestern snow fell earlier and more violently than ever. A leaden sky poured down white flakes, burying the mountains and masking the land's misery. The mountains lost their green, revealing jagged rocks like cold tombstones. The world was a suffocating, monotonous white. The old proverb says snow promises a good harvest, but that is for those with land and grain. In Brittany, bled dry by disaster and war, the snow meant only one thing: death. It meant frozen corpses, collapsed huts, and the final end of any hope for survival. Ferran Bridgehead, once a vital stone fortress guarding the Rhine tributary, had been a key strategic point. Now, the fortress that once flew the kingdom's banners had become a purgatory. Black smoke was the most striking sight of all. Smoke from the fortress's burning towers, warehouses, and homes rose into the leaden sky, twisting in the freezing north wind and mingling with falling snow to create a scene of grim despair. The air reeked of charred wood, grain, blood, excrement, and the chilling scent of terror. Screams, laughter, clashing steel, and collapsing structures tore through the fallen fortress. The narrow streets had become a slaughterhouse and a site of chaotic revelry. A frenzied mob of soldiers, clad in stolen furs and rags, wielding farm tools and rusted blades, surged through every courtyard. They kicked in doors and smashed chests, looting everything from moldy rye and copper coins to iron pots. Women were dragged off amidst bestial laughter, while any man who resisted or moved too slowly was struck down without mercy. Corpses lay scattered in the snow, their warm blood melting the white ground before being buried by fresh flakes. Children wept in their mothers' arms, and the elderly huddled in corners, praying for death to end the nightmare. The central square, once the site of markets and gallows, had become the stage for this bloody celebration. The Viscount's blue banner, emblazoned with a golden griffin, had been ripped down and discarded in the blood-stained mud. A mud-caked, hole-ridden boot ground the griffin emblem into the filth, leaving clear, muddy prints. A figure was shoved to my knees beside the trampled flag. My deep blue, silver-trimmed official uniform was shredded and stained with mud and blood. Disheveled hair obscured my face, which was twisted in terror and humiliation. My hands were bound tightly behind my back with coarse rope that bit into my flesh. I tried to maintain my dignity, but my trembling body and uncontrollable sobbing betrayed my despair. A pair of sturdy, metal-riveted leather boots stopped less than a foot from my nose. The owner stood over me, surveying the shivering prey. Above the boots was a broad, powerful frame encased in scarred but well-maintained armor. Over the armor hung a tattered red cloak, dark as dried blood, snapping in the wind. The man's face was weathered by the northwest winds, his skin as rough and yellowed as aged leather. A thick, tangled beard hid most of his face, leaving only eyes that burned with cruelty, cunning, and madness in the firelight. Those eyes studied the kneeling official like a new toy, radiating a malice that seemed to scorch the soul. He stood with arms crossed, exuding a posture of arrogant disdain. Behind him stood a circle of fierce guards, clutching various weapons. They looked at the official with mocking hatred and the excitement of predators about to feed. This was Gustav, a name that, across Brittany and the Northwest, could silence children, enrage nobles, and spark both hope and terror in the desperate. Born to the lowest peasant class, his ancestors had spent generations toiling on a lord's land. As a youth, his size earned him a spot in the local militia, where he learned basic combat and witnessed the cruelty of the masters. After leaving, he worked as a caravan guard, traveling widely and befriending others dissatisfied with the world. He had seen the luxury of the royal capital and the desolation of the borders, the banquets of the rich and the cannibalism of famine years. His peasant longing for stability had been ground into dust, replaced by deep resentment and a belief in the law of the jungle. Years of natural disasters and man-made cruelty had plagued the Northwest. Taxes rose, exploitation intensified, and the powerful seized land without restraint. Plague, drought, and locusts left the fields barren and the larders empty. Cannibalism had ceased to be a historical horror and became a daily reality. When Gustav's own small plot was seized by his lord for debts, his life shattered. His parents died shortly after, broken by grief and illness. When he tried to protest, he was beaten and branded a troublemaker. In a rage, he killed the lord's steward and became a wanted fugitive. On the run, he drew to him other desperate souls: bankrupt artisans, indebted hunters, deserters, and starving miners. Initially, they survived by raiding tax collectors and merchants, using his knowledge of the terrain. As their numbers swelled, they became a force. They sacked manors and killed corrupt officials, their notoriety spreading far and wide. Old officials and gentry, ruined by Count Boris's iron-fisted reforms in Huenum, began to look toward these outlaws with secret hope. They provided intelligence and supplies, hoping to use Gustav as a blade against the old marshal. Gustav knew their game, but he didn't care. He wanted survival and vengeance against an unjust world. To him, laws and nobles were merely parasites feeding on the poor. As for Count Boris, the reformer from the royal capital, Gustav scoffed. He was just another scavenger, and his justice couldn't feed the tens of thousands under Gustav's command. Relying on others was useless. One had to rely on their own blade. His force grew from dozens to thousands, becoming a regional power. No longer content with petty raids, he began seizing towns and declaring himself protector of the realm, a title dripping with irony. He claimed to protect the poor from traitors, though his definition of a traitor included anyone with power or wealth who opposed him. He cared little for the actual state of the towns he protected, or perhaps he was simply blind to the ruin he caused. William, the Black Eagle, recently executed by Count Boris, had been one of his lieutenants, managing the Western territories. William's death was a blow, but it only fueled Gustav's hatred for the old marshal. Now, he had personally led his main force to capture the Ferran bridgehead, not just for supplies, but to threaten Huenum and show the world, and Count Boris, the true extent of his power. "Look up," Gustav commanded, his voice raspy and calm, lacking the manic rage one might expect from his rugged appearance. The official on his knees trembled, struggling to lift his head. Beneath messy black hair, his face was deathly pale, streaked with tears and snot from sheer terror. His shivering lips and unfocused eyes betrayed his total mental collapse. Gustav squinted, studying the man like a piece of porcelain about to be shattered. He recognized the uniform. This was likely a minor tax official or civil administrator, perhaps a second son of a fallen noble who bought his position. To Gustav, these men were parasites feeding on the people, rotten bricks in a decaying dynasty. Name? Rank? Gustav asked with idle curiosity. I am Henry de Laval, tax collector and counselor. The official stammered. Tax collector? Gustav sneered, his voice cutting through the surrounding cries. A lapdog squeezing oil from us poor wretches for your master? No, I was just following orders, the court's taxes, the Lord's rules. Henry babbled incoherently. Rules. Gustav stepped forward, nearly crushing Henry's fingers. I am the rule, he roared. Your rules force people to sell their children and eat each other. I'm setting new rules today." He grabbed Henry's hair, forcing him to face the crowd of rebels and survivors. "Look," Gustav bellowed. "This is your former master, a man who lived high on our blood, now kneeling like a dead dog." The crowd erupted in cheers and curses, their eyes reflecting a mix of vengeance, fear, and twisted excitement. Henry closed his eyes in agony, shaking uncontrollably. Gustav released him, letting him collapse. He stepped back, brushing off his hands as if he had touched something filthy. He scanned the crowd, his gaze landing on a noble banner trampled in the mud. He raised his foot and stomped down with all his might, grinding the griffin emblem into the frozen, muddy earth. "From today on," he shouted, his voice echoing across the blood-stained square, "Felon Bridge belongs to me. The grain and wealth are yours. I make the rules here. Follow me, and you won't go hungry. Resist, and this is your fate." He drew a blood-stained broadsword, pointing it toward the sky, its blade gleaming coldly against the smoke and snow. "Kill the nobles. Seize the granaries. Take Huenum. Capture the old dog Boris." The crowd roared in unison. The cries signaled the fall of another town, marking the beginning of deeper, bloodier suffering for the Northwest. Driven by hatred and despair, Gustav's forces tore through the last vestiges of order, surging toward the heart of the kingdom. Meanwhile, Count Boris was on the march. Cold winds whipped across the Huenum plains, but the soldiers' eyes burned with the fire of a recent victory, even as Boris's brow remained furrowed. Boris stood on a hill, overlooking his troops. His army had been transformed since his arrival. Ludwig's 2,500 Eagles Nest cavalry, now fully paid, were disciplined and high-spirited, serving as the vanguard. Boris had used funds from Rockefort Manor and seized assets to overhaul the local border guards. He purged the corrupt officers and those who embezzled military land. He replaced them with battle-hardened veterans and reliable refugees, giving them land to ensure their loyalty. Soldiers with a stake in the land fought with a new, fierce determination. Charlotte's 1,500 Rhineland militia, though poorly equipped, were fanatically loyal to the Rockefort family. Boris now commanded over 12,000 capable, well-supplied troops. The Battle of Tal Valley was the test. Facing William's 20,000 rebels, Boris avoided a direct head-on clash. He used his main infantry to engage steadily, wearing down the enemy while utilizing the terrain. Ludwig's cavalry acted as a razor, harassing and picking off isolated units. They lured the agitated rebels into the narrow, mountain-flanked Tal Valley. As the rebels crowded the valley, Friedrich von Schmidt's hidden shock cavalry charged from the slopes like thunder. The center collapsed, and Charlotte's Rhineland militia sealed the valley's only exit. It became a slaughter. The rebels realized they were facing a disciplined, professional army. Arrows rained down, and the infantry line pushed forward, crushing all resistance. William attempted to flee, but Charlotte pursued him relentlessly. The young knight shot William's horse, and he was cut down in the ensuing chaos. The victory was decisive. Thousands killed, over 10,000 surrendered, and Boris suffered minimal losses. Boris did not pause to celebrate. He hosted a banquet in Huenum, inviting all the local officials and merchants. The atmosphere was seemingly festive, with toasts and praise flowing freely. Once the guests were intoxicated, Boris signaled his guards, who immediately sealed the hall. Boris produced a list, publicly exposing the crimes of corrupt officials and those who had aided the rebels, ordering their immediate arrest and property seizure. He replaced them on the spot with his own trusted, capable subordinates. Other wealthy families were forced to donate their ill-gotten gains to the military and disaster relief. This relinquishing of power over wine was a ruthless masterstroke of political cleansing that left no room for dissent. By purging the opposition in Hewingham and installing his own men, Bowles secured vast wealth, land, and grain. The Rockefort family's debts were repaid in full overnight, with a surplus remaining. Confiscated lands were used to settle refugees, recruit able-bodied men, and compensate meritorious soldiers and military households. As the saying goes, those with property have peace of mind. Soldiers and farmers who received land reached a new level of loyalty to Bowles. Through military victory and political purging, Bowles brutally but effectively straightened out Hughingham's fiscal and land crises. Just as Bowles planned to consolidate the three-border region, an urgent report shattered his plans. Gustav, the protector of the realm, and a bandit leader far more dangerous than William, had captured the Ferran bridgehead, a key crossing on the Rhine River. This meant Gustav's main force could now strike directly at the heart of Hughingham. With the bridge lost, the path to the eastern granaries and wealthy towns lay open. Damn it, Bowles cursed. He had underestimated Gustav's speed and the incompetence of the bridge's defenders, intending to deal with Gustav only after securing the region. Now, the hardest bone to chew was at his doorstep, backed by tens of thousands of desperate, newly supplied outlaws. William was a minor irritation. Gustav is the true threat, Bowles told his inner circle, pointing to the map. He is cunning and fierce. If he pushes east through our undefended territory, our recent victories and morale will vanish, leading to total collapse. He looked at his commanders firmly. We must abandon the cleanup and march east to intercept Gustav immediately. We must force him back across the river. Scouts, find his main force's position and movements at once. The commanders obeyed, realizing the true test of their survival had begun. The victory at Tal Valley was merely an appetizer. Gustav was the true litmus test for their foothold in the northwest. Exhausted, Bowles's army turned into the winter wind, forced into a grueling march toward the eastern wilderness. The joy of their recent victory was quickly replaced by heavy pressure. A tense silence filled the ranks, broken only by the creaking of wagons and the shouts of officers. Bowles rode, staring at the gloomy eastern horizon. That direction held the battlefield that would decide his fate and the future of Hughingham. He touched the stern imperial decree from the royal capital in his pocket, demanding he finish the bandits and march north to reinforce the throne. Empress, your death warrant comes at a poor time, he sneered. If I leave now, Hughingham falls. Good luck to Eisenberg holding the capital's flank. Speed up the logistics. Tell the men. Victory means 3 acres of irrigated land each, 5 silver coins per head, and titles for killing Gustav. Bowles commanded. He needed to use direct incentives to push his tired troops to their limits. Target, Eastern Hills. Advance. Early December, northern frontier. The north was colder than the northwest, with biting winds whipping the marching army. Banners snapped in the wind, looking listless. 10 days after leaving France City, the loyalist elite force was moving at a frustratingly slow pace. They marched only 20 miles a day, acting as if they were on a leisurely winter drill rather than a rescue mission. Count Rockefeller's 20,000-strong main force moved toward the royal capital with deliberate, unsettling ease. Their orderly ranks and massive supply trains displayed the power of the North's premier family, yet lacked any sense of urgency. They followed military doctrine perfectly, but lacked the speed required for war. Amidst the morning fog, a smaller force of 3,000 men quietly detached from the main army and turned south. This was my Carnford army, led by Leon's 500 light cavalry and Roland's 2,500 infantry. Though this was their first long-distance expedition, morale remained high. The supply wagons were packed with months of grain, rendering any excuse of insufficient supplies moot. I rode in the center of the column. Wrapped in a heavy fur-lined cloak, my face was largely obscured, revealing only a cold, firm jawline. As snow melted on my shoulders, I looked south toward the field territory, the domain of my biological father, Duke Schmidt. The word father stirred complex emotions in me, deeper than the northern chill. Duke Schmidt was a powerful southern magnate and my biological father, yet he had been absent for 20 years. My memories of him were vague, colored by my mother Lady Irene's words and the cold realities of political marriage and abandonment. Yet, paradoxically, this father had provided crucial support when Carnford was rebuilding and surrounded by enemies. Grain, weapons, and officers had flowed into Carnford through secret channels. Without this aid, Carnford could never have recovered so quickly. This support was undeniable and substantial. Is it because I am his son? Guilt over my mother? Or a cold political investment? I wondered. Regardless, I judged by actions, not intentions. The Duke's aid was a cornerstone of their success, and I was grateful. However, This gratitude was entirely different from the deep affection I felt for my mother. It was a complex emotion, tainted by calculation, necessity, and a lingering sense of wariness. It is easy to accept a mother, but difficult to accept a father who appeared only when one became valuable. Meeting the Duke was both planned and forced by circumstances. I had to march north, but I refused to tie my fate to Count Rockefeller's half-hearted efforts or risk my men for the sake of Eisenberg. Linking up with my father's Southern Army was the best strategy for survival and maneuverability. Deep down, Luo Yao truly wanted to meet this father and see what kind of man he really was. My lord, a hurried voice interrupted my thoughts. The royal envoy, who had been anxious since leaving French City, caught up on horseback. He forced a smile and asked, "Joining Duke Schmidt is safe, but the situation at Eglinist is dire. Count Eisenberg is begging for help daily. Are we moving too slowly? If we lack supplies, we should buy them from passing villages to speed up." "I am burning with anxiety," he added, wiping away non-existent sweat. To survive, Luo Yao and his remaining northern frontier troops resorted to the primitive survival method they learned during their retreat: raiding. They avoided larger towns, targeting only the poorly defended, remote villages scattered across the wilderness. Scouts became raiding vanguards, with dozens of soldiers striking like starving wolves in the dead of night or at dawn. They breached fences, stealing only food, livestock, and clothing. They had to vanish into the mist or woods before the villagers could sound the alarm. The villagers could only hide and weep, viewing these soldier bandits as a natural disaster and cursing their luck. Reaching the vicinity of Castle Mario, the situation worsened. The area was densely populated and backed by the Count's strong garrison. Locals were hostile toward Li Yao's guest army, setting up roadblocks and patrolling with farm tools, driving away any soldiers who approached. Knowing that attacking Castle Mario would be suicide for my starving, demoralized troops, I forced them to bypass the settlements and endure the wilderness. The grueling journey, despair, and fear of the Solonians eroded the army's remaining cohesion. The soldiers' eyes shifted from anger to a numb, hollow, and eventually bloodshot, violent state. "Why us? Why the hell us?" Whispers of despair and rage spread through the camp like sparks under dry tinder. Small-scale disobedience and fights over moldy bread became rampant. Discipline crumbled under the weight of starvation. I felt like I was holding a bundle of oil-soaked firewood. I relied on my remaining prestige, threats of military law, and empty promises of supplies at Eglinist to keep the army from falling apart. By the time they reached the highlands outside Castle Mario, the troops were exhausted, starving, and digging for roots and field mice. Soon, the gates of Castle Mario opened, and the plump Count Mario rode out. "General Luo Yao, you look exhausted. Please, enter the city. I have prepared wine and grain for your men." Luo Yao's starving officers gripped their sword hilts, staring at the Count with bloodshot eyes. "Stop," I growled. I forced a stiff smile and bowed. "Your kindness is appreciated, but we have orders to fulfill. We will manage on our own." Count Mario's smile froze. "As you wish, General." He turned back, and the gates slammed shut. The food crisis remained a poison blade. Watching the smoke from the market, the aroma of food tormented the soldiers' crumbling nerves. I couldn't wait. I gathered my personal guards and the last 10 emaciated warhorses, their final mobility and symbol of dignity. "We go to the market to trade for food," I said with desperate resolve. Their arrival at the market caused a stir. Merchants guarded their goods or shut their stalls, eyeing the beggar soldiers with disgust. I approached a grain shop. The owner tried to close the door, but I blocked it, my bloodshot eyes fixed on him. "I'm trading horses for grain. At market price." The merchant realized these were desperate, cornered troops. The horses, though thin, were quality northern stock. Grain was a hard currency. Greedily, the merchant held up 2 fingers. "1 horse for 100 pounds of mixed grain. Bran and beans, enough to fill you up." "What?" A guard drew his sword. "That's robbery. These are northern warhorses worth 50 gold coins each." The merchant puffed his chest, feeling safe near the castle. "In these chaotic times, horses are useless. Look at them. They might not survive the winter. Take the deal or leave it." The guard trembled with rage, ready to strike. Stop! I barked, my chest heaving. I knew this was extortion. Selling these horses meant admitting they were no better than bandits. Yet, I looked back at the camp, hearing the hunger and seeing the madness in my men's eyes. Could I watch my brothers starve or turn into monsters? General, we can't. A guard pleaded. I closed my eyes and sighed. Trade them all. Ultimately, we traded our 13 remaining war horses, including my own, for a mere 1,300 pounds of low-quality grain mixed with bran, sand, and stones. The merchant gleefully weighed the grain, fearing the beggar soldiers would change their minds. Holding the empty reins and watching my men scramble like wolves for the meager grain, I felt my heart being sliced by a dull blade. I had lost my mobility, my mount, and the last shred of my dignity as a general. I returned to the highland camp with the sandy grain. For over 3,000 mouths, it was as light as a feather and as heavy as a final straw. The perimeter sentries were practically empty, with only a few old soldiers dozing off. Soldiers were sneaking back with stolen sheep. They looked at me with cold indifference. I didn't stop them. I knew any interference would ignite the dry tinder of the camp. In the center, officers sat around pots of foul-smelling gruel. When they saw the pathetic grain bags and my empty reins, their suppressed emotions exploded. Bang! A scarred battalion commander snapped his wooden stick. 13 battle-ready horses. For this pig swill. Another officer spat. Those field bastards. We bleed for them, and they won't even feed us. Why? We fight the Solonians in the north, while they hide in the city eating and drinking. Why do they treat us like this? Field is rotten to the core. They deserve to be crushed by the Solonians. A bloodshot-eyed officer stood up, his voice low and dangerous. I see it now. The kingdom, the court, they don't care if we live or die. We have swords and guns. If the kingdom won't feed us, we'll take what we need ourselves. The words food and shelter exploded through the camp like thunder. It was a declaration of rebellion. Silence fell, but in the eyes of the starving soldiers, a predatory green light flickered, a mix of approval and vicious relief. General, let's rebel. We'll carve a path, storm the castle, and take their food and women. Anything is better than waiting here to die. Luoyao instinctively roared. Rebel? Have you lost your minds? Do you owe nothing to the king or Count Rockefort? We are soldiers of the kingdom, not bandits. He tried to invoke loyalty and honor to wake his crumbling army. Before he finished, a cold blade pressed against his throat. The mutinous officer held it, his eyes filled with fanatical resolve. Luoyao's guards drew their weapons, but the officer's glare and the blade at Luoyao's throat forced them to freeze. Loyalty? Huh. The officer laughed bitterly. Wake up, Luoyao. Look at these men. Look at what they wear and eat. He pointed at the soldiers. We crawled out of the northern frontier, fighting the Solonians to protect the border. And what did we get? The border fell, our homes are gone, and the lords in the royal capital don't even see us as human. The officer pressed the blade, drawing blood. They dragged us here for loyalist reinforcements without a single warm meal. They treat us as cannon fodder. It is the court that forces our hand. General, lead us to survive, or we'll clear the path ourselves, he threatened. Luoyao glared, unafraid. You want me to be a traitor? Kill me first. He pressed his neck against the steel. The officer hesitated, knowing the army would collapse without Luoyao. We don't want to die. The king and the queen mother won't feed us. They'll just use us as fuel for the war. No more dying for a fatuous king. The soldiers roared in agreement. Even Luoyao's loyal guards began to tremble. They didn't want to die of hunger or cold in this wasteland. Home was better than this. Seeing their desperate faces and feeling the blade at his throat, the dam of Liao's loyalty and discipline finally collapsed. He realized his army was no longer a royal force, but a pack of desperate beasts. Anyone standing in their way would be torn apart. He closed his eyes, recalling the smoke of the southwest peninsula, the blood at Tyrol, and the countless brothers who had already perished. When he opened his eyes, all struggle was gone, replaced by a hollow, gray exhaustion. Put the sword down. Luoyao knew there was no turning back. This bloody path was their only chance for survival. He had to act fast. Duke Schmidt and I were nearby. If they learned of the mutiny, they would crush his starving, ill-equipped men in hours. Hesitation meant defeat. Luoyao's resolve hardened. He was a veteran of the Solon Wars. A risky plan formed instantly. Quiet, he commanded. Storming Castle Mario is suicide. We'd be trapped and slaughtered by the main army within days. The crowd quieted, fearful. Then what? Wait to die? Luoyao sneered. No. That fat count invited us in with promises of food. We'll go in, not as lambs, but as starving tigers. The officers realized his intent and grinned. Let's do it. Luoyao sent word to Castle Mario, pleading for aid due to their lack of supplies. Count Mario, thinking he could exploit the starving soldiers before disarming them, agreed. Open the gates. Welcome the royal force, he ordered, confident that a group of starving men posed no threat. The gates opened. Luoyao's men entered, eyes fixed on the food in the plaza. The soldiers gorged themselves while Luoyao and his officers were ushered into the main hall. Count Mario toasted them, and Luoyao offered a forced, complex smile. After a few drinks, the count asked, "Are you heading north to fight the Solonians?" "By the king's order, yes," Luoyao replied. The count feigned righteous indignation. "The Solonians are a scourge. I wish you victory in reclaiming our land." The other officials echoed his cheers. "Reclaim the land?" Luoyao repeated, a twisted, mocking smile spreading across his face. His officers joined in with cold, manic laughter. The count's smile froze. Luoyao's expression turned icy. He stood up, staring at the count. "Reclaim the land? Defeat the barbarians." He began to laugh, a sound full of bitter, desolate rage. "Count Mario, you are right. We were meant to bleed for the kingdom. But before we reclaim those distant lands," Luoyao hissed, "I'm going to reclaim you." He smashed his silver goblet. His officers lunged, overturning tables and drawing blades, striking at the terrified nobles. The hall erupted into screams, and the sound of steel meeting flesh as blood stained the carpets. Treason. Enemy attack. Guards outside tried to intervene, only to find the plaza in chaos. The starving soldiers had transformed into demons, slaughtering the unprepared garrison. The garrison, expecting to easily disarm the weak, were overwhelmed by the ferocity of the mutineers. The castle became a slaughterhouse. Resistance collapsed instantly. The rebel knight fell, and the civil officials were helpless. Count Mario, terrified, crawled into a corner, trembling and pale. He pointed at the blood-soaked Luoyao, shrieking, "Luoyao, you're insane. This is treason. You'll be executed along with your entire clan." Luoyao approached, his boots crunching on blood and broken porcelain. His armor was splattered with gore, making him look like a demon from hell. He stared down at the cowering count with cold, bottomless eyes. "Treason." Luoyao's voice was hoarse and calm, yet carried more weight than a roar. "Count Mario, all you high and mighty lords, listen well." He raised his voice, addressing the castle and the world. "I, Luoyao, and my brothers who crawled out of the death pits of the northern frontier and the southwest peninsula, never wanted to rebel." He pointed his sword toward the sounds of slaughter outside. "It is you. This damned kingdom. You lords in the royal capital, France City, and warm castles who treat us like stray dogs, cannon fodder, and disposable chips. You forced us to this. We just wanted a meal, a way to live, to fight like men, not die like dogs from hunger, cold, or betrayal. You closed every door, extinguished every light, and trampled our dignity. Now, we are breaking down the doors to find our own path." He paused, his sword tip hovering over the count's heaving chest. "You forced this." The fall of Castle Mario opened the gates of hell, unleashing the most primitive, savage desires and fears. As the last organized resistance was crushed and Count Mario's screams faded into smoke, the castle transformed. The wealth, order, and thin veneer of civilization vanished, replaced by a lawless, bloody hunting ground. Discipline, law, and mercy dissolved like ice under a scorching sun, overwhelmed by long-suppressed rage, naked greed, and the instinct for survival. Like a wolf pack tasting blood, the soldiers could not be reined in. Luoyao did not stop them. He tacitly allowed and directed this uncontrollable torrent. Once the initial chaos subsided, he led his personal guards through the blood-slicked streets. This was not to restore order, but to efficiently plunder resources to sustain his rebel army. He caught a thug looting a shop. Terrified by the blade at his throat, the man spilled everything he knew. Spare me. The richest man is Boss John, the silk and spice merchant. His villa in the East Market has a bronze lion on the door. His warehouse is piled with gold and silver. And Mr. Mark's grain store on West Street has enough grain to feed the city for a year. And the widow Madeline in South City. Her late husband was the biggest merchant in the field territory. She has tons of jewelry. Guided by the thug, Luo Yao became a cold, efficient commander of plunder. Boss John's mansion was sealed tight, with sounds of weeping and furniture being pushed against doors from within. Luo Yao waved his hand expressionlessly. Smash it! His guards charged like starving hyenas. With axes and brute force, the copper-reinforced doors groaned and shattered. The servants behind them were sent flying. Kill, Luo Yao commanded. The guards swarmed in, blades flashing. Whether they were guards or begging servants, all were harvested like grass. Blood soaked the expensive carpets and splattered the master paintings. Luo Yao stepped into the chaotic hall. The air was thick with the nauseating stench of blood mixed with lingering spices. He scanned the cowering women, wives, daughters, and maids, with indifference. To him, they were merely objects. Search. Take all gold, jewelry, silk, and antiques. Kill the men. Leave the women to the brothers outside. The guards moved like trained ants, prying open every lock and secret compartment. Warehouses revealed mountains of gold and silver. Hidden rooms yielded gems and fine silks. Chests were filled until they overflowed, with coins spilling onto the floor, sparking frantic scrambles among the soldiers. A guard cursed. Damn these greedy merchants. They sat on mountains of gold while we starved, refusing us even a moldy bun. They forced us to take up blades. Luo Yao felt nothing but a cold, hollow silence. These merchants and nobles would let grain rot and gold rust rather than spare a single coin for the soldiers dying for them. There was no warmth in this world. Morality was a figment. Laws were merely chains for the weak. Only the blade, the armor, and the stolen grain were real. The lesson was branded into his heart with blood and fire. With the collaborators leading the way, Luo Yao's men looted the major warehouses, filling several wagons with wealth. Elsewhere, the looting devolved into pure, primitive savagery. A scarred officer and his blood-crazed men smashed into a wealthy estate. An elderly steward opened the door, trembling. Please, take the money and grain. Just spare our lives. The scarred officer grinned, revealing blackened teeth. I want it all. Money, women, and your life. He kicked the door, sending the steward flying, blood spraying from his mouth. Kill them all. Take everything, the officer roared. Suddenly, a muffled matchlock musket shot rang out. The lead soldier collapsed with a hole in his chest. Ambush! The soldiers scattered, seeking cover. Arrows and lead balls rained down from the windows and balconies. The household had organized a desperate final stand. Damn them! Kill them all! Burn the house! The officer bellowed. The soldiers' ferocity was fully ignited. Using doors and furniture, even the corpses of their comrades, as shields, they charged again. At close range, the matchlocks were too slow to reload, and the resistance crumbled like paper. The defenders were slaughtered in the courtyard and halls. The officer, ignoring the looting, stepped over the blood and headed up the stairs. His leather boots sank into the soft carpet with muffled thuds, each step forming a grotesque symphony with his ragged breathing and the screams, manic laughter, and sounds of smashing and breaking rising from the floors below. He kicked open an intricately carved bedroom door with brutal force. A wave of rich, sweet fragrance, the powders and lavender of a noblewoman's private chamber, rushed to meet him, forming a violent contrast with the reek of blood, sweat, and gunpowder that clung to his body. The scent struck him like a torch to dry tinder, igniting the darkness that had been coiling inside him all night, the bloodlust of battle twisting into something far uglier and more savage. A young girl in a plain cloth skirt, her maidservant's hair still neatly pinned, stood with her arms spread wide before an ornately carved bed draped in lavish curtains. Though her face had gone white as parchment and her entire body trembled like a leaf in a storm, she held her ground, her voice shaking yet carrying the last remnants of dignity and defiance. You monsters, traitors, heaven will not suffer this. His Majesty the King will not let you go unpunished. When the armies of prey arrive, they will surely, Silence. The officer's blade rose and fell in a single motion. The keen edge drew across the girl's slender throat, and warm crimson bloomed across the embroidered silk bed curtains like a grotesque flower. The girl crumpled to the floor, hands pressed to her throat, eyes still wide open, filled with terror and bitter refusal to accept what was happening. The officer didn't spare her a single glance. He seized the heavy bed curtains and tore them aside. Beneath the bed, a young woman in a silk sleeping robe huddled with her knees drawn to her chest, her hair loosened and disheveled, her beautiful face now a mask of pure terror, trembling like a startled fawn. She tried to press herself further back, but there was only the cold stone wall behind her. A naked hunger for domination blazed in the officer's eyes, savage and unrestrained. He laughed, a wild, unhinged sound, and snatched her slight frame out from beneath the bed as easily as a hawk seizing a sparrow, hurling her onto the tumbled silken coverlets. I've had tavern women and peasant wives, but a real noblewoman? Never had that pleasure. Tonight that changes. The young woman let out a short, piercing cry and fought back with every ounce of strength she had. Kicking, scratching, clawing at the iron grip of his arms, but against the brute force of a soldier in full fury, her resistance amounted to nothing. Her silk robe was torn away without effort, and what was revealed only deepened the madness consuming him. The assault that followed was without mercy. Scenes like this played out in countless corners of the fallen fortress. The wealthy, the middling classes, even ordinary families who had managed to set a little aside, none were spared. Fires broke out in multiple places, black smoke boiling into the night sky. In a single night, Marienburg, once a thriving symbol of order and prosperity, had been utterly transformed into a living hell ruled by violence, depravity, and death. The plundering was no longer about survival. The brutality was no longer about vengeance. Everything had slid into the abyss of pure, mindless release, a frenzy of destruction for its own sake. Luoyao stood beside the wagons heaped with gold, jewels, silks, and antiques, priceless wealth beneath his feet, while from a distance came the mingled, fading sounds that were this fortress's final testament. The flickering firelight played across his face, blood-stained, yet cold and unyielding as iron. No excitement, no guilt, only a bottomless, frozen emptiness. He knew. From the moment their horses shattered the city gates, from the moment the first drop of civilian blood touched their armor, from the moment the first woman's despairing scream tore open the night sky, this army had severed with its own hands every last thread connecting it to the title of royal forces, to order, even to the very identity of human. The road ahead held only a crimson-soaked wilderness of thorns, winding toward an unknown destruction from which there was no return. The plodding march had gone on for days now. Our column heading north kept a steady, unhurried pace, as though we were on a routine border patrol rather than riding to relieve a position besieged by a great army. I rode at the heart of the column beside my father, Duke Schmidt, keeping precisely half a horse length behind him out of respect. Father was in an unusually talkative mood today. He sat astride a magnificent chestnut warhorse, a deep purple gold-embroidered cloak draped over his armor, commanding yet splendid. At times he pointed his riding crop toward the distant mountain ranges, recounting battles he had fought there against some rebel faction years ago. At other times the topic shifted to the undercurrents stirring in the kingdom's court, as he dissected the temperaments, factions, and likely schemes of the key power players. His voice was steady and commanding, carrying the weathered sharpness of a man who had held power for a long time and understood the world for what it truly was. His words were laden with insight into power, human nature, and veiled hints about the future. These were the lessons he hoped I would absorb and apply in the contests that lay ahead. So you see, Carl, victory or defeat on the battlefield often has little to do with how many soldiers you command. What matters is whether you know how to make use of allies, how to divide your enemies, and how to reveal or conceal your strength at precisely the right moment. Take this chaos in the north. Soren is the wolf. Eisenberg is the fox. The royal family is a tiger that has grown sick with age. And we, He paused and glanced at me with a measured, meaningful look. We are the eagle, waiting for our moment to strike. We must seize the prey while keeping watch for the wolves and tigers at our backs. Strength must be spent wisely, reserved for the blade's edge and for the decisive moment. To reveal all your cards too soon is not the way of a wise man. I gave a slight nod. Father's instruction is sound. Read the situation, deliberate thoroughly, and only then commit to action. That is always the superior approach. This rare moment of easy conversation between us was shattered without warning by a sudden thunder of hoofbeats. A single horse came tearing toward us in a cloud of dust. The rider was coated in grime from head to foot, his face ashen, his lips cracked and dry, the unmistakable look of a man who had ridden hard across a great distance. More alarming still was the figure slumped motionless across the back of his saddle, drenched in blood, and dressed in a manner that was not the uniform of our own army. Urgent report. Urgent military dispatch. The scout yanked his reins just a dozen paces from father, his horse rearing and screaming. He practically fell from the saddle, dropping to one knee, gasping so hard his voice cracked into a rasp. Your Grace. Young Lord Carl. An urgent message from the rear. Father's brow furrowed. He reined in his mount and said in a low, firm voice, Speak. The scout drew a deep breath and forced his voice steady, though the shock and urgency in it could not be concealed. General Loyao's forces. General Loyao's forces have mutinied. They stormed and took Marienburg the night before last. The city has been put to the sword. Count Marienburg is believed to have been killed. The rebel forces are burning, killing, and looting throughout the city and may press on to attack neighboring fortresses. What? Even father, with all his composure, could not stop the color draining from his face. A fierce light flashed in his eyes, and the hand gripping his reins tightened almost imperceptibly. Marienburg was no mighty stronghold, but it was a well-defended, noble fortress commanding a critical passage. How had Loyao's ragged beggar army, starving, under-equipped, and broken in spirit, managed to breach it within a day or two, and killed the count? The news was staggering, far beyond what father could have calculated about that remnant force's capabilities. My own shock was no less violent. Luoyao? The general I had encountered on the main road, haggard and wretched, barely holding the semblance of a military formation together, reduced to begging me for grain? His gaunt, hollow-eyed men, barely capable of marching, let alone fighting, had mutinied and taken a fortress? Marienburg, and that greedy, miserly count who had shut his gates in their faces, who had perhaps indirectly driven them to this very rebellion, was dead? The sudden upheaval hit like a boulder dropped into a still lake, scattering every thought I had in an instant. Beyond the shock, a pang of regret rose in me. When I had given Luoyao those provisions, it had been out of a soldier's reluctant compassion and a desire to prevent him from deteriorating into a roving band of marauders who might threaten our own lines. Yet none of it had been enough to stop his rebellion. Had I known, I would have given him far more. While father and I were still reeling from the news, the blood-soaked figure slumped across the scout's saddle suddenly stirred. A voice emerged, barely more than a breath, ragged and broken. Your Grace. Carl, my lord, quickly, send troops to pursue them. The rebels must not be allowed to continue plundering or the consequences. With great effort the figure lifted his head, revealing a face drained ghost-white from blood loss, caked in grime and dried blood. His gaze was unfocused, yet he fixed his eyes desperately in the direction of father and me, the plea in them absolute and heartbreaking. By his uniform, what remained of it, he appeared to be one of Marienburg's garrison soldiers. Before the last words had fully left him, his head lolled sharply to one side. His arms fell limp. The final breath left his body, and he was still. To deliver this blood-soaked intelligence, he had clearly spent the very last of what life he had. Complete silence fell over the column. Only the restless snorting of war horses and the moan of the wind remained. The very air seemed to congeal, a heavy, blood-tinged chill spreading through the ranks. The scout's voice was trembling as he added, I found him collapsed by the roadside during patrol, my lord. He had barely a breath left in him. He forced out these words with everything he had. I dared not delay, and brought him here at once. Father's expression had darkened to something storm-heavy and dangerous. He slowly raised his head, his gaze sweeping like a hawk's over the faces of the commanders who had gathered at the news, all of them unsettled and uncertain, before coming to rest on the south, toward Marienburg, then flicking briefly northward toward the royal capital and the eagle's nest. Emotions crossed his eyes in rapid succession: shock, fury, calculation, and beneath it all, a barely perceptible thread of cold, cutting shrewdness. "The beggar army has mutinied," Father repeated in a low murmur, "and taken the city, and killed the count." This was not merely the mutiny of a broken remnant force. This was the most brazen and grievous challenge to the kingdom's order imaginable, a bloodied blade driven straight into the heart of the realm. In its nature and its consequences, it far surpassed any ordinary banditry or military uprising. If left unchecked, the rebels could destabilize the region and threaten Franklin to the south. For the nobles tasked with suppressing them, failing to act would damage their reputations and interests. Furthermore, the rebels are currently behind them. Ignoring them risks their logistics, retreat routes, and the stability of the field territory. My mind raced. This rebellion disrupted my slow and steady northward march, yet it provided a convenient pretext. A rebel force of thousands seizing a noble's castle is a major emergency, justifying a pause in my march to pacify the interior before resisting external threats. I could report to the royal capital that local defenses were so incompetent that I was forced to clean up the mess. This would delay my confrontation with the Solonians, allow me to claim credit for the suppression, and provide leverage to demand more supplies and authority from the capital. I calculated the implications. Luoyao's rebellion would draw eyes from the northern frontier to the capital. The rebels would become a target for various factions. How would the Queen Mother react? What would bulls do in the northwest? The situation had grown exponentially more complex. More importantly, with Castle Mario fallen, Luoyao had gained supplies and recruits. Would they hold the castle, raid the area, retreat to the field territory, or join the Solonians? They had to be stopped immediately. "Father," I said, my voice urgent, "Luoyao has taken Castle Mario and secured grain and arms. They are becoming a serious threat. They are mostly veteran border troops. If they roam freely or join the Solonians, the situation in the northern frontier will worsen significantly. If we ignore them, we defy royal orders and jeopardize our own supply lines." I highlighted the risks: underestimated combat power, potential defection, and the threat to our own forces, to pave the way for my father's decision. Duke Schmidt nodded, satisfied with my insight. With cold authority, he addressed his generals. "Karl is right. These rebels are guilty of treason and must be eradicated to restore order." His tone shifted. "However, they are emboldened by victory and hold a fortified position. A hasty assault would weaken our strength, undermining our primary mission to reinforce the king." The Duke looked toward the north. "The capital, the lords, and the Solonians are all watching. The rebels are now a piece on the board. We must not act rashly." He issued the order: "Halt the northward march. Turn the army around. We are suppressing the rebellion. Advance steadily. Deploy all scouts to track their movements, strength, and morale. Do not engage without my orders. Cavalry, stand by. Keep your distance and observe. Infantry, turn and advance slowly. Maintain supply lines." The generals were confused by the lack of a decisive strike, but they obeyed. "Understood." The Duke turned to me. "Take the elite Conford troops to the front. You know Luoyao. This task is yours." He lowered his voice. "Your mission is to monitor them, not crush them. Determine their true intentions. If they hold the castle, surround them and cut off their communications, especially to the north. If they flee, follow and pressure them, driving them where we want them to go. Do not force a decisive battle unless they head north to join the enemy. Let this fire burn long enough for everyone to see." I realized my father intended to use the rebellion as a buffer. The longer the rebels remained a threat, the more justification we had to stay in the safer south rather than entering the northern meat grinder. It was a dangerous balancing act, preventing the rebels from spiraling out of control while using them to buy time and attract attention. Yet, as a royal army, was it right to allow the rebels to pillage while we merely followed? My conscience struggled with the thought of burning villages and crying civilians. I understood that in this cruel world, personal ideals often had to yield to harsh reality. Survival and power were paramount. I was no longer a child. I had to prioritize my own strength. Yes, Father, I understand. December 8th, Sigmund Year 1, Privy Council, Royal Capital, Play City. Treason? Castle Mario has fallen. Count Mario is dead. Queen Mother Katarina's scream echoed through the hall. She gripped the blood-stained report, her knuckles white. Her face, usually meticulously painted, was pale with rage and terror. The messenger prostrated himself, trembling. Why, yes, your majesty. The rebel Luo Yao led 5,000 men to seize the castle. The garrison was wiped out, and Count Mario was burned at the stake. Useless fools. The Queen Mother threw the report and smashed a heavy silver inkwell against the wall. Ink splattered across the mural. The ministers and officers cowered, not daring to breathe. The Eaglenist is besieged, the Salonians are at the gates, and Eisenberg is begging for reinforcements. And what are you doing? Moving like snails. Now the fire is in our own backyard. The dogs raised in the field territory have bitten their master. Are they trying to overthrow the kingdom? Her eyes scanned the room like poisoned daggers. She was targeting the local lords who had been dragging their feet. 5,000 remnants took the castle? Is the garrison made of mud? What has Elmer been doing with the funds provided? Her rage targeted the entire corrupt and inefficient military system. A deeper fear gnawed at her. They have supplies now. Will they march on the capital? She stood up, her voice sharp. Issue my decree. Mobilize the capital garrison. Gather 50,000 men immediately. Destroy them in the field territory. Do not let them near the capital. Marquis Barton will lead the force. Give him full authority, men, grain, whatever he needs. I want Loyal's head. As you command. The ministers echoed, though they were privately worried. Draining the capital's defenses was risky, and Marquis Barton was known for being overly cautious. But no one dared object. Just then, another attendant entered with a sealed letter. Your Majesty, an urgent report from Duke Schmidt. The Empress Dowager snatched the letter and read it quickly. Her brow smoothed, but her expression darkened, as if she had swallowed something foul she was forced to stomach. I wrote that Liao's rebel army had captured Castle Mario and was ravaging my rear, threatening my logistics and retreat routes. To ensure the safety of the loyalist reinforcements, I requested permission to turn back, suppress the rebels, and secure my rear before marching north to rescue Eaglenist. Humph. Discretionary action indeed, the Empress Dowager hissed, nearly tearing the letter. She knew my game. While Eaglenist was in danger, the rebels threatening my supply lines were an immediate, personal crisis. My excuse for delaying the northern march was logically sound. She could not refute it. By volunteering to suppress the rebellion, I made it impossible for her to refuse without appearing heartless toward her own general. The old fox. Yet, with Solon in the north and treacherous warlords in the middle, she had few options. I held significant military power and was at least willing to fight the rebels, which was better than the others who feigned ignorance. Stabilizing the rear was better than letting the rebels grow or threaten the royal capital. Granted, she gritted out, ordering the Minister of Internal Affairs to draft an edict appointing me as anti-rebellion governor. I was granted full authority to suppress the rebellion in the Mario region and ordered to march north immediately upon completion. The minister bowed and left. The Empress Dowager sat back, tapping her armrest in exhaustion. With wolves in the north, tigers in the south, and foxes in between, ruling this empire was agonizing. Unlike the chaos in the capital, Luo Yao, at the eye of the storm, displayed a cold, efficient clarity. The brief euphoria of looting Castle Mario had not blinded him. By slaughtering nobles and looting, he had burned his bridges. The court's wrath and surrounding forces were imminent. He knew his newly blooded army was fierce but lacked a foundation. If the imperial court mobilized, his forces would be wiped out. Speed is the essence of war, became his sole creed. He had to break out of the encirclement, engage in mobile warfare, live off the land, and find allies or a new base. Staying in one city meant death. Unlike the sluggish beggar army that arrived, Loyao's force now possessed grain, weapons, and some muskets seized from the armory. He forcibly confiscated 30% of the loot as military funds. After feeding his men, he used iron-fisted discipline to reorganize them. He rewarded the fiercest veterans with gold and brutally suppressed those who defied his authority, re-establishing his command. He knew their obedience was based entirely on the promise of more loot and survival. We cannot stay. Leave the heavy, worthless items. Travel light. Target, Silver City, 120 miles southeast. It's rich with merchants and has weaker defenses than Castle Mario. We'll have the capital to deal with the court once we take it. Luoyao roared to his exhausted, excited troops. He focused on the core incentives, wealth and survival. To Silver City, the soldiers cheered, their greed ignited. They abandoned heavy supplies, carrying only grain, weapons, and gold. A black torrent of soldiers, led by Luoyao, surged southeast. They moved with newfound speed, driven by the hunger for more plunder. Any village that resisted was destroyed, providing further supplies and recruits for the bandits. On the evening of December 9th, they reached Silver City. Known for silver and trade, the city had low walls and lax defenses, offering little resistance. The garrison, mostly untrained conscripts, crumbled instantly before the battle-hardened rebels. Luoyao didn't even need his minion cannons. One charge breached the defenses. The gates fell, and the rebels poured in. The tragedy of Castle Mario repeated, even more violently. The looting lasted 2 days and 1 night. Luoyao then withdrew with massive wealth, leaving behind a smoking ruin. On the morning of December 11th, they reached Wheatwave City. This grain-trading town had no real walls, only earthen barriers and fences. As the rebel army, now 8,000 strong, appeared, officials and wealthy merchants fled, leaving only civilians and a few abandoned guards. The rebels entered without effort. Luoyao ordered free looting for 3 days and performed a calculated move. He opened the city's dungeons. The heavy doors were smashed open. Inside were not just criminals, but oppressed tenant farmers, debtors, and bandits. These people harbored deep resentment against the system. When the rebels armed them and promised food, clothing, and revenge against the rich, these social outcasts joined the ranks as the most fanatical vanguard. Their local knowledge and ruthlessness significantly increased the rebels' destructive capacity. By the afternoon of December 12th, the army had swelled to nearly 10,000, though only half were true veterans. The rest were refugees, thugs, and freed prisoners. As they left the smoking Wheatwave City with their massive, bloated caravan, the nature of the army had fundamentally changed. The rebel army had transformed into a snowballing monster, fueled by hunger, greed, and hatred. Their march was chaotic and undisciplined, yet radiated a terrifying, destructive aura. Shortly after leaving Wheatwave City, scouts reported, "General, a force of 3,000, including hundreds of cavalry, is pursuing us from 30 miles back. Their banners belong to Carnford, led by I. Karl von Schmidt." Luoyao tightened his reins, brow furrowed. He remembered the cold, disciplined young lord who had once generously gifted him grain. My disciplined troops and elite equipment had left a deep impression on him. They were a formidable foe, especially compared to his own bloated, undisciplined, and plunder-heavy force. "He's fast," Luoyao muttered. While Duke Schmidt's main force might be lagging, my vanguard was already on their heels. A field battle against their heavy cavalry would be suicide. His 10,000 men were a loose rabble. Only the few thousand veterans from the southwest were reliable. If I pinned them down until the Duke's main army arrived, they were doomed. "Order," Luoyao commanded ruthlessly. "Discard all heavy, worthless clutter. Keep only gold, grain, and weapons. Abandon the captives. If they can't keep up, leave them. We turn northeast into the mountains to lose the pursuers." "What about the women and craftsmen?" An officer hesitated. "Dump them," Luoyao snapped. "Survival is all that matters. We can find more women later." He knew that any delay would be a death sentence. He had to be ruthless. The rebel army resumed their frantic flight. They discarded furniture, clothes, and grain, heartlessly abandoning the weeping women and conscripted craftsmen by the roadside. Driven by fear, the army surged toward the northeastern mountain range like a panicked herd. Morning mist clung to the peaks of Stardust Ridge. I stood on a ridge, staring grimly at the path leading toward the field territory. Behind me, the Carnford army paused, catching their breath. The relentless pursuit through rugged terrain had left even these hardy soldiers exhausted. My lord, we've reached the exit of Stardust Ridge. Ahead lies the plains of Golden Stack Castle and Pearl Bay, Leon reported, his face caked in mud. I nodded, holding off on the order to pursue. I surveyed the valley. Abandoned, smoking supply wagons, scattered grain, and heavy household goods littered the path. Further off, abandoned women, children, and the elderly huddled in the cold, weeping. These were the burdens Luoyao had discarded to save his own skin. Luoyao, ruthless and decisive, I remarked coldly. I recognized this as a desperate but necessary move to shed weight. By abandoning his loot and captives, Luoyao was sacrificing everything for a slim chance at survival. It was a desperate gamble. The rebel army was bloated with criminals and refugees, making it chaotic and difficult to command. Luoyao knew he had to reach the field territory, his home base, before being pinned down by the Carnford army or surrounded by the Duke. He would discard anything to get there. "Shall we pursue, my lord?" Roland asked, eyeing the abandoned civilians with unease. I shook my head. No. Slow down, maintain formation, and advance cautiously. Scouts, move 10 miles ahead. Luoyao is a cornered beast, but he knows this mountain terrain well and favors traps, I said coldly. If we rush into an ambush in unfamiliar territory, we risk disaster. I added, we've chased them for hundreds of miles. We need rest. The rebels are desperate and dangerous. Rest for 1 hour. Water and feed the horses, check gear. Double the scouts. Clear all valleys and passes for 20 miles before we move. Yes, Leon and Roland obeyed. They understood the need for caution. Overconfidence against a desperate foe was fatal. Luoyao was a seasoned survivor, and his potential for a counterattack could not be ignored. I watched the smoke from the abandoned civilians' fires with a complex expression. I knew this delay might allow Luoyao to escape, but I could not gamble with my army. Preserving my strength was a commander's primary duty. I was responsible for the lives of the men who followed me. Messenger, I called to a guard. Inform the Duke that the rebels have discarded their supplies and are fleeing toward the field territory plains. We are resting to avoid ambushes. Warn the Duke that Luoyao's goal is likely his base at Pearl Bay. If he fortifies there, he will become a permanent threat. The messenger rode off immediately. I then ordered a guard. Send 10 riders to Carnford. Tell Werner and Klein that a rebellion has broken out in the field territory and the rebels may attempt to flee by sea. Order the Navy to prepare. Intercept any rebel ships at all costs. The guard left to carry out the orders without delay. I was correct. Luoyao had no capacity to set an ambush. Luoyao knew that stopping to fight would be suicide against a superior, disciplined force. His only path was to run, trading space for time until he reached his familiar territory. While I rested, Luoyao's forces plunged into the vast, wealthy, and undefended plains of the field territory. Once the granary of the Plantagenet, this land was a network of rivers, fertile soil, and prosperous towns. Long years of peace had left its defenses in total decay. Local garrisons consisted of the elderly and infirm, with neglected fortifications. The lords prioritized wealth over military readiness. When Luoyao's hardened, bloodthirsty veterans struck, the result was a one-sided slaughter. Luoyao's tactics were brutal and effective. He did not seek to occupy. He sought only to sustain his army. His goal, seize supplies and clear the road to Pearl Bay. Against towns lacking bastions or moats, he didn't even need his minion cannons. He used light cavalry to scatter scouts, then forced conscripted laborers to build simple scaling ladders and rams. The main force would then swarm the walls. The fragile defenses crumbled instantly. Many garrisons surrendered or fled at the mere sound of the rebels' war cries. Nobles and merchants fled, often becoming prey for the rebel cavalry. Sack the city. 3 days of unrestricted plunder. This became the rebels' mantra, a license for carnage and debauchery. Wealth, food, women, and wine became their primary objectives. Town after town fell under the rebels' iron hoofs. Screams, laughter, and the roar of flames composed a symphony of death across the plains. Granaries were emptied or burned, homes were looted, and the population was slaughtered or enslaved. The rebel army grew like a snowball, fueled by chaos and plunder. They left behind only smoke, ruins, corpses, and broken lives. Luo Yao sat on his horse, surveying his army of over 10,000. It was a chaotic, undisciplined mob held together only by greed and fear, leaving him feeling cold and anxious. He knew he was on a path of no return. Every town sacked and every tragedy committed severed his last ties to his past as General Luo Yao. He was no longer a soldier or a vengeful victim, but a reviled rebel leader and a butcher destined for infamy. Yet he could not turn back. My pursuit and the encroaching royal army loomed like a hangman's noose. Ahead lay only the slim hope of reaching Pearl Bay. He steeled himself, suppressing his remaining humanity to drive his beastly army forward through fire and blood. Almost there, Pearl Bay, a fortress, supplies, the sea, perhaps a chance at survival. He repeated to himself like a drowning man clutching at straws. December 20th, dusk, outside Golden Wheat Stack Fortress. Seeing the familiar banner of the Golden Wheat Sheaf, Luo Yao's eyes ignited with a mix of hatred, sadistic pleasure, and a desire for destruction. Golden Wheat Stack Fortress was one of the wealthiest and most fortified strongholds on the Field Territory Peninsula. Its master, Count Kraft, was the man who had once welcomed them for rest only to betray them, seizing their supplies and weapons before casting them out to die. Kraft, old dog, Luo Yao hissed, his voice raspy with venomous hate. It was here that he and his men had suffered their greatest humiliation and were pushed onto this path of no return. To him, the fortress was no longer a military target. It was a sacrifice to be washed in blood and fire. General, it's Golden Wheat Stack. That bastard Kraft's nest, a scarred officer, one of his fiercest subordinates, growled with matching hatred. The veterans, those who had suffered the humiliation of Kraft, gripped their weapons, the air thick with palpable bloodlust. Listen up, Luo Yao commanded, his voice cold as a hellish wind. Rest for 1/4 hour. Eat and fill your bellies. Tell the men, ahead is the nest of that old dog Kraft, who stole our food and weapons. The fortress is full of grain, gold, and women. Break the gates. 3 days of unrestricted plunder. Everything you take is yours. Settle your debts and wash away our shame with the blood of Kraft's entire house. Roar! The rebel camp erupted in a cacophony of vengeful shouts and demands for blood and loot. Fatigue and fear were instantly replaced by primal greed and the lust for slaughter. The army, now a pack of beasts, waited with bloodshot eyes to tear the fortress apart. The setting sun bathed the towers and walls of Golden Wheat Stack in a blood-red hue. The fortress defenders, having spotted the approaching horde, frantically rang bells and scrambled to close the gates. To Luo Yao and his crazed rebels, this was merely a futile, dying struggle. Attack in 15 minutes. By sunset, I will be drinking on top of that old dog Kraft's head. Luo Yao drew his blood-stained blade, pointing it at the trembling fortress. Luo Yao stared intensely at the crumbling Golden Wheat Stack fortress amidst the smoke and fire. After hours of assault, the fortress was battered. Sections of the wall had collapsed under cannon fire and desperate manual labor, exposing the pale, panicked faces of the defenders. Amidst the screams and the sound of shattering stone, his rebels swarmed the breaches and scaling ladders like wolves, wave after wave. He spotted the portly figure of Count Kraft on the tower, his face twisted in a mix of terror and despair. This was the man who had stripped him of his dignity and reduced him to a stray dog. The fire of vengeance burned in his chest. He could already imagine dragging Kraft from the tower to pay his blood debt. His soldiers fought with equal ferocity, driven by the promise of loot and the chance to vent their hatred against the nobility. Inside, Count Kraft, drenched in sweat and blood, screamed orders, forcing his terrified servants and conscripted farmers to plug gaps and throw hot oil and stones. He knew there was no escape. If the city fell, he and his family faced a horrific fate at the hands of the rebels. Driven by the instinct to survive, the pampered Count showed surprising resilience, using the high-quality weapons he had previously seized from Luo Yao to hold the line. Quick! Block it! Use stones. Logs. Push them back. Kraft shrieked, his body trembling with fear. He watched the sea of monsters below, feeling as if he were staring into the gates of hell, jumping at every surge of the enemy. Luoyao sat on his horse, his knuckles white, his nails digging into his palms. Victory was within reach. Half an hour more, and he would wash away his shame in Kraft's blood. Suddenly, a scout broke through the rear, pale-faced. "My lord! Disaster! A massive cavalry force is approaching from the rear. It's the banner of Confort. My cavalry. They are less than 10 miles away." The news hit Luoyao like ice water, extinguishing his vengeful fire. The man who had crushed the Solonians and reorganized Confort, was here? How could I be so fast? Luoyao looked back, then at the fortress, torn by agonizing frustration. His men were locked in brutal combat at the breach, and Kraft's hateful face was so close. Should he risk everything for a final strike, or retreat? Survival instinct narrowly won out. He could not afford to lose his army now. He had to live to fight another day. A sharp, urgent retreat horn cut through the battlefield, stunning the rebel forces who were on the verge of victory. Retreat. All forces, retreat toward Golden Scale Port. Now, Luoyao's personal guards galloped through the ranks, shouting the order. Despite their confusion and resentment, the rebels obeyed Luoyao's authority and their fear of my cavalry. They abandoned heavy siege equipment and fled toward the southeast, leaving behind a chaotic scene of carnage and corpses. Count Kraft watched the tide of enemies recede, paralyzed with shock. Only when the last rebel vanished did he collapse onto the blood-stained ramparts, gasping for air as cold sweat drenched him. He had survived, but the sheer terror of how close he had come to annihilation left him hollow. "It's the kingdom's reinforcements," he stammered to a nearby guard, grasping at the only logical explanation for Liao's sudden withdrawal. Soon, the rhythmic thunder of hooves announced a disciplined cavalry force bearing the black and gold lion banner. At their head was the young, imposing Lord I. Kraft scrambled to his feet, frantically smoothing his filthy robes before rushing to the ruined castle gate. "Lord I, thank the gods. You've saved my entire family," he groveled, nearly kissing my stirrup. I scanned the devastated battlefield, the breached walls and piles of dead, with a sharp gaze. I knew that had I arrived a moment later, this place would be a slaughterhouse. I cared little for Kraft, whom I suspected had provoked the rebellion, but the man's survival was secondary to the mission. "Where is Luoyao?" I asked, my voice cold as a northern gale. Intimidated, Kraft pointed southeast. "The bandits fled toward Golden Scale Port, my lord. They just left." I nodded, ignoring Kraft, and raised my whip. "Pursue." The cavalry surged forward like an iron flood, leaving the fortress behind in a cloud of dust. Watching them go, Kraft felt a mix of relief and resentment at my cold indifference, though fear remained his dominant emotion. Returning to his ruined castle, Kraft shuddered at the memory of Liao's hateful eyes. He knew the storm was far from over, and the young lord I brought a pressure that felt just as formidable as the vengeful Luoyao. I was not overly concerned about Luoyao attacking Golden Scale Port. The city was well fortified, well supplied, and commanded by the experienced Governor Elmer. As long as the port held, the rebels would be trapped between the city walls and my pursuing forces. Noting the biting wind and my soldiers' exhaustion from the forced march, I decided they needed rest. Past the order, I commanded. "Fall back 5 miles, set up camp in a sheltered area with water. Monitor the fortress, but do not provoke them. Rest the men and horses. We decide our next move at dawn." I needed the night to recover my troops' strength, gather intelligence on the fortress and Luoyao's position, and attempt to contact Governor Elmer. A cold, salty wind whipped off the dark sea, battering the stone walls of Golden Scale Port. The wind whistled through the battlements like a ghostly wail. On the walls, torches flickered in the gale, casting erratic shadows over the tense, weary faces of the defenders. Soldiers lowered oil-filled lanterns to illuminate the frozen moat and the cleared, trap-filled ground beyond. Further out, small watchtowers and bastions glowed with campfires, watching the darkness like the eyes of predatory beasts. This port was the lifeline of the field territory and Governor Elmer's final stronghold. Elmer stood atop the South Gate Tower, his hands white-knuckled as he gripped the stone railing. Dressed in a luxurious velvet robe over an ill-fitting, rusted breastplate, he looked absurd. His hair was windswept, but he ignored it, staring fixedly at the dark mountains miles away. On the northern slope, a sea of flickering lights burned like hellfire. Thousands of rebel campfires illuminated the hillside, a terrifying sight that looked like a slumbering beast watching the port. Nearly 10,000. Elmer muttered, his voice dry and lost to the wind. His face was bloated, his eyes bloodshot and trembling with fatigue. When news arrived of Luo Yao sacking Golden Stack Castle, he knew trouble was coming. But seeing the sheer scale of the rebel camp in person far exceeded his worst fears. Scouts estimated the force, comprised of refugees, prisoners, and conscripted laborers, had swelled to nearly 10,000. Though perhaps only half were true soldiers, their fanatical, violent energy was palpable even from miles away. "Governor," a voice spoke from behind. It was a deputy, a stern knight who could not hide his own anxiety. "The envoy we sent to negotiate has returned." Luo Yao refused to see him, sending word. "Tell Elmer to wash his neck, for I am coming to take his head." "Stubborn fool," a goat-bearded scribe interjected, his voice trembling despite his attempt at bravado. "My lord, have no fear. Our walls are high, our supplies vast, and our 10,000 troops are elite. This rabble cannot touch us." He raised his voice, trying to bolster the room. "They are mere bandits, only capable of raiding weak towns. Besides, Duke Schmidt and Lord I are closing in from behind. Once they arrive, we will crush these rebels between us. You will be credited for the victory before the Empress." "Enough," Elmer rasped, his voice thick with exhaustion and irritation. He knew the strategic reality. The city was strong, and reinforcements were coming. He should have been confident, ready to wash away the stain of his previous surrender to Solon. But he knew the truth. His fear was not of the disorganized rebels outside. He feared the cold, suspicious eyes of the royal capital, the Empress's wrath, and his own precarious, crumbling power. Luo Yao is a general under Elmer, a remnant of the Northern Territory forces Elmer took in and sent north to reinforce the king. Now, this unit has rebelled, slaughtered a city, killed nobles, and thrown the field territory into chaos, all while the eagle's nest is under siege. This is a fatal political failure, a betrayal of the Queen Mother's trust, and a crime that will doom Elmer. The Queen Mother promoted him not for talent, but because his status as a sinner of the previous regime made him a useful, dependent tool to suppress rivals. This relied on him being useful and maintaining order. Now, Luo Yao has rebelled. This proves Elmer's incompetence in command and judgment. He has allowed his subordinates to incite chaos, shaming the court and the Queen Mother. This is worse than his past surrender to Solon, that was forced by military defeat, while this is a failure of internal management. Even if he holds Golden Scale Port and Duke Schmidt and I arrive to crush the rebels, the credit will go to them. Elmer would at best be credited with a tenacious defense, barely offsetting his failure. His political enemies will surely seize this to accuse him of colluding with rebels or harboring them for personal gain, linking it to his past surrender to Solon. Fearing the Queen Mother's cruelty and his enemies' ruthlessness, Elmer feels a bone-chilling dread. He envisions his downfall, imprisonment, and execution. He mutters the names Schmidt and I with complex emotions. Duke Schmidt is a northern powerhouse, cunning and heavily armed, perhaps not truly loyal to the Queen Mother. I, the young Lord of Conford, am the Queen Mother's son-in-law and a rising star. Are they coming to rescue him, or to seize his position in the field territory? Either way, the outcome is disastrous for him. His deputy's voice snaps him back to reality. His hands are numb from gripping the railing. He releases his grip, inhaling the cold, salty air, but his panic remains. He turns to his subordinates, but instead of orders, he lets out a heavy, soul-crushing sigh. Sigh. He waves them off. Handle the night watch with extreme caution. No one is to engage the rebels without my direct order. He emphasizes this with a suspicious, lingering gaze. The officers obey, though they are confused and uneasy. Elmer's lethargy and distraction are unbecoming of a governor facing a rebellion. Elmer wraps his velvet robe tighter and descends the tower stairs with a stumbling gait. The night is deep, with heavy snow clouds hiding the moon. Icy winds howl through Golden Scale Port, while the rebel campfires outside glow with ominous silence. The blizzard paints the world in a suffocating, ominous white. A figure hidden in a snowdrift near the city wall stirs. Covered in ice and mud, the scout, a veteran from the Northern Territory, watches the patrolling guards with the eyes of a hungry wolf. He carries a secret letter, sealed in oilcloth and wax, that holds the fate of thousands. Every second feels like torture. The wind masks the sounds of the patrol, making their footsteps and armor clanking distinct. He waits for the signal. Coo, 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 coo. 3 owl calls, 2 short, 1 long, drift from the battlements. The scout tenses and responds with an identical signal using a bone whistle. The battlements remain silent for a moment, confirming the signal. A black-painted rope drops from the wall. The scout climbs the wall with feline agility. A guard pulls him into the shadows of the battlements. The guard is a nervous soldier in standard armor. They exchange no words, only a fleeting glance. The scout hands over the warm, sealed letter. The soldier tucks it into his leather armor. Tell General Luoyao. The soldier whispers, 3 a.m., West Gate. 3 fires as the signal. The scout nods, noting the charcoal mark on the soldier's chest, their secret sign. General Fadus is waiting for the news, the soldier adds, gesturing toward a mansion in the city. The scout nods and vanishes back into the snowy darkness. The soldier, heart pounding, checks his surroundings and secures the letter. He merges back into the patrol, disappearing into the storm. Inside the secret basement of General Fadus's private residence, it is deathly quiet compared to the storm outside. A lone oil lamp illuminates the room, which smells of old parchment and dust. Fadus, a key general in charge of the West Gate, sits alone. He is a man of 40, gaunt with a short beard, his eyes sharp and cold. Though in civilian clothes, his posture is that of a disciplined soldier. He and Luoyao were former comrades who survived the Southwest Peninsula and the ruins of Tyrol Fortress together. Fadus, however, was smarter and better at navigating the treacherous military hierarchy. In the field territory, he gained Governor Elmer's trust and secured control over the West Gate. Luoyao, too blunt for politics, was sidelined and sent to the Northern Territory as cannon fodder. Fadus thinks of their shared past, noting that while they both fell, their paths diverged. He chose the safe path, while Luoyao chose the most extreme, insane one. The secret door creaked open, and the captain of Fadus's personal guards, the dark-faced soldier who had met the scouts, slipped inside and locked it. Despite his exhaustion, the soldier's eyes remained resolute. He knelt and presented a warm, sealed letter. Fadus took the letter, feeling its faint warmth. He traced the wax seal, a unique mark Luoyao and his brothers had sworn to in the northern frontier, known only to them. Years had passed, but the mark remained clear. Fadus used a silver knife to carefully slice the seal, as if severing an invisible shackle. He unfolded the letter and read it by the flickering oil lamp. Luoyao's handwriting was frantic, etched with deep resentment and resolve. The letter read, Fadus, the relief of Eaglenist is impossible. The court treats us northerners like dogs. Governor Elmer is hypocritical and suspicious. We are walking on thin ice. With supplies cut off and no retreat, we must strike now to survive. I have gathered 30 cannons and 8,000 desperate veterans outside the city. We lack only a way in. You hold the keys to the West Gate. If you open it at 3 a.m., signaled by 3 fires, we will seize the hub and share the spoils of power. Time is short. Decide quickly. Save us and share in our fortune. Fadus lingered on the final, desperate plea. He felt Luoyao's despair, anger, and the gamble placed on their brotherhood. He understood it all too well. The court's coldness, the noble schemes, and Elmer's hypocrisy. He had endured these in silence, choosing to survive within the system. Luoyao, however, had chosen to flip the table. 30 cannons, 8,000 men. Fadus whispered, his eyes gleaming. Even if Luoyao was exaggerating, this force was formidable, especially with the garrison's low morale and his own control over the West Gate. Success was plausible. The promise of wealth and power was tempting. Compared to a future as Elmer's scapegoat or a victim of the rebellion, This was a proactive choice. With my army looming and Elmer's future uncertain, the risk was high, but the potential reward was greater. Failure meant total annihilation, but success meant controlling Golden Scale Port and the entire field territory, or at least securing enough wealth to flee overseas. Phaetus closed his eyes, weighing his fate. The lamp's flickering light cast deep, gloomy shadows across his gaunt face. The room was deathly silent. Finally, he opened his eyes, all hesitation replaced by cold, icy resolve. He held the letter to the lamp. The flames consumed the paper, turning it into ash that drifted onto the stone table. "Go," Phaetus commanded, his voice steady and powerful. He looked at the kneeling guard. "Tell Bryce to prepare. At 3 a.m., 3 fires will signal the gate opening. Be clean and precise. If there is any error." He left the threat hanging. "Yes, General." The guard bowed and vanished into the snowy night. The blizzard intensified, howling against the city walls. Visibility was near zero. The lanterns on the walls swayed, turning the soldiers into grotesque, ominous shadows. The guards cursed the weather and the rebels outside. Only a few sensed the faint, metallic scent of impending blood. Inside the West Gate Tower, Bryce was restless. A rugged man in his 40s, he wore heavy, frost-covered armor and carried a broadsword. A northerner by birth, he had been promoted by Phaetus after serving with him on the frontier. He paced the cold, narrow tower, his boots echoing against the stone. He peered into the darkness, seeing nothing but wind and snow. Every second felt like an eternity. "General," a subordinate whispered, "time is near." "What about General Phaetus?" Opening the gate was treason punishable by death. Bryce glared at him, his own fear masked by a harsh, raspy roar. "Shut up. Do your job." He knew the risks, but Phaetus was his only patron in this foreign land. The promise of wealth and the shared resentment toward Elmer gnawed at him. As northerners, they were outsiders in Golden Scale Port. Better to gamble than to die for a weak governor. Suddenly, soft footsteps sounded on the stairs. Bryce stiffened, his hand flying to his sword hilt. Phaetus's dark-faced guard and several others emerged like ghosts. "Well," Bryce hissed. The guard nodded and produced a heavy, metallic token bearing Phaetus's seal. He held it out and gestured for the gate to be opened, his gaze sharp as a blade. Bryce took the token, the cold metal confirming his decision. It was Phaetus's signet, the proof of his commitment. He gripped the token tightly, the sharp edges biting into his palm, fueling his desperate resolve. Taking a deep breath, Bryce suppressed his final hesitation and signaled his nervous personal guards. "Do it." The guards lunged toward the massive gate winch like tigers. They braced their shoulders against the wooden bars, straining with all their might. Creak, creak. The massive iron winch groaned under the strain in the silent, snowy night. The sound pierced the howling wind, reaching the ears of every soldier nearby and making Bryce's heart hammer against his ribs. The iron chains rattled with a chilling, metallic friction, sounding like the chains of death. The heavy, ironclad oak gate began to rise inch by inch. The screeching of the gate hinges and the groaning of the winch sounded like a hellish overture. Cold air and snow swirled into the opening. As the gap widened enough for a small squad to pass, the moment arrived. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. 3 fire arrows tore through the dark, snowy sky, trailing orange flames like ghostly eyes. They exploded above the walls, casting a blood-red glare over the city like 3 watching eyes. "It's here." Bryce trembled, his voice cracking with a mix of excitement and terror. He stared at the fading light, his expression a complex mask of fanaticism and relief. There was no turning back now. Instantly, a deafening roar erupted from the darkness outside the walls. It was the sound of thousands of long-repressed beasts finally breaking their chains. Kill. Break the city. Loot everything. For survival, kill. A tide of dark figures surged toward the open gate like a flood from hell. Ragged and starving, they charged with eyes burning with the fire of hunger, humiliation, and vengeance. The small bastions and watchtowers outside the walls were caught completely off guard by the avalanche of attackers. The scattered fire of muskets and bows was instantly drowned out by the roar of the mob. Before they could even identify the enemy, the defenders were swarmed and torn apart by the rebel army. Screams and the sound of breaking bone filled the air. The outer outposts were obliterated like sandcastles in a tsunami. The rebel army's assault was relentless. They poured through the west gate in a brutal, direct charge. Bryce and his men feigned panic, offering token resistance before fleeing and guiding the rebels toward the city's vital points. The rebels flooded into the unprepared Golden Scale port. They split into groups with clear objectives. Some rushed the barracks and armory, while others headed for the granaries. The rest hunted for the wealthy districts. The rich areas were their primary targets for plunder and revenge. Only then did the city wake up to the sound of alarm bells, realizing it was under attack. Residents huddled in terror as the sounds of destruction drew closer. Soldiers stumbled out of their barracks into a scene of chaos, fire, and smoke, with no clear leadership. Amidst this collapse, a second blade was driven into the heart of the city. The northern frontier has rebelled. The governor has fled. Run for your lives. Phaetus, clad in shining armor and a scarlet cloak, led his elite personal guards in a coordinated strike at key intersections. They spread rumors of the city's fall and set fire to buildings to sow panic. More viciously, they ambushed organized groups of loyalist soldiers from behind, killing officers and scattering the ranks. Panic spread like a plague. Hearing that their own were claiming the city had fallen, the defenders' morale shattered. Many discarded their weapons and uniforms, trying to blend in with the fleeing civilians. In the madness, some soldiers even turned on their own comrades who blocked their escape. Inside the governor's mansion, Elmer woke to the sounds of slaughter and scrambled to the window in his nightclothes. Seeing the city engulfed in flames and hearing the savage roars of the rebels, he collapsed to the floor, his face drained of color. A bloodied guard burst in. "Governor, the rebels are in. Phaetus has betrayed us. The west gate is open." Phaetus, west gate, betrayed. Elmer muttered, his mind blank. His last shred of hope vanished. Everything, the defenses, the troops, the reinforcements, was a joke in the face of internal betrayal. He tried to rise, but his limbs felt like lead, unresponsive to his will. Meanwhile, the battle inside the city entered its most decisive and bloody phase. Luoyao remained focused, knowing he had to crush the core of the enemy's resistance to secure total victory. Luoyao rode through the chaotic streets, escorted by veteran guards, toward the smoke-filled inner barbican of the West Gate, now under rebel control. Rebel gunners and conscripted laborers had hauled a dozen heavy minion cannons and mortars into position, their muzzles looming like dark, lethal voids in the firelight. "Turn the guns. Aim for the governor's mansion and the resisting barracks." Luoyao roared, his face twisted in a blood-stained, demonic grimace. The rebels frantically adjusted the heavy artillery, clearing the bores and loading gunpowder and solid shot. Their eyes burned with a wild, vengeful fervor. This was their final hope to destroy the wealthy port and wash away their humiliation. Soon, the cannons were trained on the remaining pockets of resistance, particularly the ornate governor's mansion and nearby barricaded barracks. Luoyao approached the largest mortar, his cold gaze sweeping over the panting, fanatical gunners. He raised his blood-stained blade toward the trembling spire of the mansion and bellowed with soul-deep hatred. "Fire!" Boom, 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 boom. Deafening roars tore through the air, shaking the very earth. Orange muzzle flashes illuminated the rebels' twisted faces and the mansion's exquisite, terrified reliefs. Solid iron balls shrieked through the air. The first shell struck the mansion's tower, shattering the masonry and sending stone, wood, and gore flying into the smoke. More shells followed, pulverizing the walls, windows, and defensive clusters. The mansion and its surroundings were instantly transformed into a hellscape of fire and ruin. Sturdy architecture crumbled under the bombardment, and the soldiers' will to resist collapsed. The defensive strongholds fell silent or dissolved into panicked flight. The rebels cheered, their morale peaking. With the mansion fallen, the port's resistance was broken, leaving only the carnage of a one-sided slaughter. At dusk, as the sky turned a blood red, my vanguard arrived at the outskirts of Golden Scale Port. Even the battle-hardened veterans were chilled by the sight before them. The once prosperous Golden Scale Port had become a living hell. The thick walls stood, but battlements were collapsed and billowing black smoke. The west gate hung open, its iron-reinforced doors twisted and scarred by fire and blades. The Plantagenet banners were gone, replaced by tattered, blood-stained rags marking Luoyao's forces. Smoke choked the sky as buildings, warehouses, and ships burned. The air reeked of charred flesh and blood. Sounds of looting, slaughter, and sporadic gunfire persisted, signaling that the massacre was ongoing. Flames licked the silhouettes of buildings, casting an eerie orange glow. The harbor was littered with debris, overturned boats, and gruesome remains. Larger merchant ships and warships lay capsized or burning at the docks. Dark, chilling shapes bobbed in the water. "My lord, look!" An officer pointed to a dock where figures were busy working. Through my telescope, I saw rebels forcing captives to load timber and supplies onto relatively intact ships. Repairing ships? I lowered the glass, my eyes cold. I see. Luoyao knew that holding the city was a death sentence. With the Duke's army closing in, the sea was his only escape route. Seizing ships to flee to the islands was better than waiting for death on land. Order the army to camp on this high ground. Use the cavalry to patrol and kill any rebel scouts, I commanded. Send scouts to watch the port, but do not engage. Monitor their ship repairs and any signs of departure. Send a fast rider to the Duke. Report the situation and urge him to bring the main force and coordinate with the Navy to blockade the sea. Luoyao must not escape. Yes, the messenger departed. A day later, Duke Schmidt's main army arrived, joining my vanguard. The expanded camp, bristling with weapons and banners, stood in stark, oppressive contrast to the smoldering port. I was summoned to the Duke's tent, where the atmosphere was tense despite the roaring hearth. Duke Adolf, in soft armor, stood over a large map of the port and surrounding waters, tapping his finger rhythmically. He looked up as I entered, showing not fatigue, but a hint of relief. This reaction was strange given the loss of such a vital port. "Father," I saluted, still covered in the dust of the march. The Duke pointed to the port on the map, marked with a skull. "Golden Scale Port is lost. Elmer is likely dead, and the rebels are celebrating inside," he said with a mocking sneer. "They are looting and slaughtering, but they are also repairing ships, preparing to flee by sea," I reported. The Duke chuckled, shaking his head at the absurdity. "With those broken ships? Let them try. If Luoyao wants to be a pirate, so be it. His occupation of this port actually saves us trouble." I was stunned. The Duke stood and walked to a larger map covering the Northern Territory and Field Territory. He traced a line from France City that detoured toward Golden Scale Port, his pointer resting firmly on the harbor. "Look here, my son," the Duke said with cold, calculating calm. "Eagle's Nest is besieged. Count Eisenberg sends 3 blood-stained pleas for help daily, desperate for us to fly into the Solonians' trap, bleed for them, and ideally, weaken the enemy at the cost of our own destruction." He turned to me, his green eyes cold. "If we march north on schedule, we arrive exhausted, while the Solonians wait in comfort. Will Eisenberg even open the gates? And if he does, who provides supplies? The near-empty granaries of Eagle's Nest or the Queen Mother's empty promises? More likely, we'd be forced to camp outside, acting as bait until we are bled dry or sacrificed at a necessary moment." My heart sank with every word. I had considered these risks, but hearing my father dissect them so coldly sent a chill through me. This was the true reason for our delay. We refused to be cannon fodder, sacrificing the elite of Conford for a lost cause. But now, the Duke tapped his whip on the map at Golden Scale Port, looking almost satisfied. "Luoyao has done us a favor. By rebelling and seizing the port, he's thrown field territory into chaos. We no longer have to delay. We have a domestic insurrection threatening the royal capital that must be suppressed before we can safely head north." He sipped his tea, his tone relaxed. "Crushing the rebels and reclaiming a strategic location like Golden Scale Port is a legitimate, glorious achievement. It's far safer and more sensible than the quagmire at Eagle's Nest. Even the Queen Mother cannot object. Failing to stop a rebellion that threatens the capital's flank is a far greater disaster than losing Eagle's Nest." I remained silent, realizing my father had turned a catastrophe into a perfect excuse to remain stationary while securing political gain. Any lingering sympathy I felt for Luoyao was shattered by this cold political calculation, leaving only irony. Therefore, the Duke said, his gaze sharpening, we stay put and lay siege to Golden Scale Port, trapping Luoyao inside. He pointed to the sea. I've ordered our fleet to join Werner's forces and blockade the port. Not a single rebel ship will escape. On land, our combined force of 20,000 will surround them. Let's see how long Luoyao's stolen grain lasts. His ships are mostly merchant vessels, easy targets for our navy. His tone turned ruthless. We will strike from land and sea, using cannons to destroy their docks and any hope of escape. We will starve them out or annihilate them in a field battle. This secures our victory, eliminates the threat, and proves the Schmidt family's loyalty and strength to the royal capital. He emphasized loyalty with a trace of mockery. As for avenging the people of field territory, the Duke paused, indifferent. That is merely a convenient justification. More importantly, the territory is devastated, and Governor Elmer is likely finished, regardless of whether he survives. This region needs a new, powerful, and loyal ruler to restore order. The implication was clear. The Schmidt family would seize control of field territory as a reward for restoring order. It was a logical progression for the family to claim the territory's political and economic spoils. I listened, my mind reeling. My father's plan was masterful, cold, and calculated, turning a crisis into a strategic opportunity. Every step preserved our strength, expanded our influence, and kept us out of the meat grinder at Eagle's Nest. Father's plan is flawless. I understand, I replied, lowering my eyes. I could not argue. It was undeniably the most advantageous path for the Schmidt family. Winter's peak had arrived. A leaden sky hung over Eagle's Nest, pressing down on the blackened towers and battlements. Icy winds howled, biting at the frozen faces of the soldiers on the walls. Count Eisenberg, wrapped in a silver fox fur cloak, stood alone on the highest rampart. Though nearly 60, his once straight back was now hunched under the weight of his burden. His eyes were sunken with exhaustion, his graying hair whipped by the wind. He stared intently at the wilderness below. The valley, once a passage to the northern frontier, was now a death trap of steel and earth. The Solon army's camp covered the land like a rusted, encroaching moss. Thousands of leather tents and earthen bunkers stretched endlessly along the valley. The air was thick with the suffocating stench of smoke, waste, and the brutal presence of a massive army. Even more terrifying was the death zone between the camp and the fortress walls. Deep trenches, wide enough for horses, snaked around the fortress, encircling it completely. The trench floors were spiked, and the edges were fortified with earthen walls and firing slits. Between the trenches stood reinforced walls with arrow towers and cannons, aimed like vipers at the fortress. Caltrops and Czech hedgehogs littered the ground, blocking all paths. Solonian scouts patrolled constantly, ensuring no messenger or scout from Eagle's Nest could escape. 2 months. It had been 2 months. Since the Solon army arrived, time had frozen, slowly tightening the noose around the fortress. The outer warning outposts and beacon towers had fallen early in the siege. Eagle's Nest was now a desperate island, adrift in a sea of war, waiting for the final wave to shatter it. Heavy, weary footsteps approached. Eisenberg didn't turn. He knew who it was. Valerius spoke in a raspy voice. Count, the firewood is nearly gone. We've burned everything in the warehouse, even 500 old saddles. It's barely enough to keep the men from freezing. Eisenberg's shoulders trembled, but he remained silent, pulling his cloak tighter against the internal chill. Fuel had been a cold viper gnawing at my heart for 2 months. Before the siege, I had stockpiled a year's worth of grain, reinforced the walls, and prepared ample arrows and oil. I had accounted for everything except the fuel needed to survive the northern frontier's brutal winter. Eagle's Nest, built on a rocky ridge, lacked timber. Cut off from trade and foraging, their lifeline was severed. Most non-essential structures and warehouses had already been burned for heat. Now, with even military saddles gone, I faced a grim choice: demolish civilian homes or structural supports. The thought of my soldiers huddling in freezing barracks, dying of frostbite and gangrene, filled me with a dizzying sense of helplessness. This silent, Creeping cold was more lethal than sullen steel. It was draining the fortress of its life and morale from within. How many died? I asked, my voice barely audible. 17 last night, Valerius replied, mostly from the infirmary and the sentry posts. I closed my eyes, inhaling the biting air. I pivoted to the next crisis. And the horses? The tens of thousands of mounts were their only mobile force and a vital food reserve. They're on grain, Valerius said, but that will last less than a month. Then we must either slaughter them or feed them fodder and bark. Slaughtering them meant abandoning all hope of a cavalry breakout, a signal of total despair. It was a desperate, final measure. Horse meat would only delay the inevitable. A long, bitter sigh escaped me, heavy with exhaustion. Those warlords. 2 months. The Queen Mother has issued countless decrees, yet not a single reinforcement has arrived. Are they waiting for me to die so they can carve up my territory? Valerius stepped closer, lowering his voice. My lord, a pigeon arrived from the south. There's been a disaster in field territory. I glared at him. What now? Did the Solonians reach field? No, Valerius replied, his expression complex. A mutiny. A general named Luo Yao turned against Governor Elmer, leading thousands of troops in a rebellion. They've sacked several cities. Even Golden Scale Port has fallen. I reeled, my face turning paper white. A mutiny? Golden Scale Port is lost. The kingdom's granary and treasury fallen to rebels? It was more absurd than a Solonian invasion. Is the report certain? I stammered. The secret letter is reliable, Valerius said. The rebels are moving fast, aided by traitors within the cities. The royal capital is in chaos. The Queen Mother is preoccupied with the rebellion. She can't spare us a thought. I let out a shrill, manic laugh that echoed off the cold walls. Can't spare us? What a time to be alive. My face twisted with venomous despair. I'm here holding the border against the Solonians, and they're busy tearing each other apart for land. The Queen Mother is fighting her own people instead of the barbarians. I waved a hand weakly, my rage spent. Every flicker of hope was extinguished. Surrounded by enemies, abandoned by the crown, and starving in the cold, I had lost everything. It was the end of the kingdom. I turned away, refusing to hear more of the daily death tolls or the desperate pleas to slaughter the horses. Meanwhile, on the plains east of Heavenham, the sky hung low with leaden clouds. A biting wind swept across the field, carrying the suffocating weight of an impending slaughter. 2 armies stood in silent confrontation. Count Boris's 10,000 men were stretched thin in infantry squares, trying to cover a wide front. Though their gear was mismatched, the officers kept the line steady. Spears pointed toward the sky, and musketeers and archers checked their weapons, the air thick with the scent of sulfur and oil. A few light cannons were positioned at the front, the gunners tense. The only sounds were the snapping of banners and the nervous shifting of horses. They had to stretch their lines to avoid being flanked, but this left them dangerously thin. Could they withstand the first charge? Count Boris sat on his black warhorse, his expression iron-hard, his eyes scanning the field. His trump card was Sir Friedrich's 1,500 heavy cavalry, hidden behind a low ridge. They were his only hope to turn the tide, provided the thin infantry line could act as a reef against the coming wave. He was gambling his life and the fate of Heavenham. On the left flank, Charlotte patrolled in front of the Rhineland Legion. Her line was the thinnest, stretched like a cicada's wing. She felt the heavy breathing of the young soldiers and saw their trembling hands. Facing 10,000 men was enough to terrify even the most seasoned veterans, let alone these green recruits. Hold steady, warriors of Rhineland. Charlotte's voice cut through the wind. Remember your training, trust your comrades. Our home is behind us, there is no retreat. Her tone was resolute. She drew her sword, the blade flashing in the dim light. I stand with you today. Glory to Rhineland. Seeing their young knight's unwavering gaze, the soldiers' panic subsided. They steadied their formation, responding with low, determined shouts. Internally, Charlotte's heart hammered against her ribs, her palms slick with sweat. The pressure from the vast enemy host was suffocating. She thought of her son, Klein, and the hidden image of me. A pang of sorrow struck her. Perhaps they would never meet again. She crushed the thought instantly, replaced by iron-willed duty. If this line broke, Count Boris's center would be flanked, and the entire front would collapse. Heavenum would be exposed to the 10,000 bandits, dooming her lands and people to slaughter. She had to hold this line. Suddenly, the massive enemy formation began to stir like a waking beast. A tide of humanity surged forward. At the front were ragged refugees, driven by the veterans behind them like mindless foam on a wave, forced toward death. Behind them lurked the elite, bandits and cutthroats, hidden like sharks in the chaotic current. Dust choked the sky. The ground trembled under the thunderous, uneven stampede of countless feet, as if the horizon itself were closing in. "Hold! Do not retreat!" officers roared. Charlotte dismounted, tossing her reins to an attendant. "I stand with you," she shouted, grabbing a heavy spear from an aide. The cold metal steadied her nerves. She took her place at the front right, the most vulnerable point of the line. She planted the spear, her silver armor and blue cloak standing out like a beacon against the dark, chaotic backdrop. "Rhineland," she bellowed. "Fight to the death!" The soldiers roared back, emboldened by their knight standing in the front rank. The bandit vanguard entered bowshot, but Count Boris remained silent. He waited until the enemy was dense enough for maximum lethality. "Fire!" A clear command rang out from the center. Bowstrings hummed like death's own instrument, and muskets roared, filling the air with acrid sulfurous smoke. Arrows and lead balls tore through the front ranks, turning the ground into a blood-soaked field of screams. Hundreds fell instantly. Panic rippled through the bandits, but those who tried to flee were cut down by their own rear guard. "Charge or die!" the veterans shrieked. Trapped between two deaths, the mob surged forward in a frenzy. Cannons joined the slaughter, carving bloody paths through the mass, yet the tide of bodies remained relentless. As the enemy closed in, the musketeers scrambled to reload. "Retreat! Spearmen forward!" The ranged troops pulled back through the gaps as the spearmen leveled their weapons, creating a wall of steel. Boom! The two forces collided, a chaotic wave crashing against a rigid wall of spears. The air filled with the sickening sound of steel tearing flesh and bone, accompanied by a symphony of screams and clashing metal. Charlotte braced herself, pouring her strength into the spear shaft. She felt the sickening resistance of flesh as her spear pierced a crazed refugee who continued to struggle even as he coughed blood. Fighting back nausea, she yanked the spear free, sending the man to the ground. More enemies pushed forward, driven by the pressure from behind, heedless of the carnage. Some were impaled, others ducked under the spears, hacking at the shafts. The formation began to buckle under the strain. "Fill the gaps," Charlotte commanded, her spear darting out with lethal precision to strike down attackers. Her sword training served her well. She handled the spear with deadly efficiency, felling several bandits in quick succession. The pressure was immense. A spear from the side grazed her helmet, sparks flying. She dodged, but the tip struck a young soldier behind her in the throat. He collapsed, blood spraying onto her cloak. Consumed by rage, she thrust her spear through the attacker's throat. The line was retreating. In the close-quarters melee, the long spears became a liability. "Drop the spears. Draw swords," Charlotte shouted, casting her own weapon aside. Charlotte drew her bastard sword, the blade feeling like an extension of her own body. She moved with lethal, agile precision, abandoning her spear style for a ruthless, close-quarters technique that targeted joints, necks, and armor gaps. Back-to-back with her guards, she held the most dangerous section of the line, using precise thrusts and parries to anchor their defense. Despite her skill, the sheer volume of enemy attacks meant she could not evade everything. A mace blow numbed her shoulder, a rusty blade dented her arm armor, and she narrowly dodged several other lethal strikes. Blood, hers, her enemies, and her fallen comrades, coated her armor, while sweat and gore stung her eyes. The battle devolved into a brutal, bloody melee. Inspired by Charlotte, the Rhineland Legion held the line with desperate tenacity, every second feeling like an eternity. Amidst the slaughter, flashes of Klein's laughter, my steady gaze, and the warmth of a fireplace in Conford flickered in Charlotte's mind, providing both strength and agony. She fought on, a silver eagle battling a dark tide, fueled by the need to protect everything behind her. She held on, waiting for Count Boris's signal and Friedrich's heavy cavalry to emerge from the shadows. Count Boris stood by the command banner, his hands trembling as he weighed the balance of the battlefield. He watched Charlotte, a lone boat in a storm, her silver armor stained with blood as she struggled against the black tide of enemies. He waited for Gustav to commit his final, elite reserves into the meat grinder. Only once the enemy was fully committed and exhausted could Friedrich's heavy cavalry deliver the crushing blow to shatter their core. To secure Heavenham, they had to annihilate the enemy's backbone here, rather than merely driving them back. Yet, the cost of waiting was devastating. Despite his precautions, the endless waves of bandits were slowly tearing his thin defensive line apart. Spear phalanxes had collapsed into chaotic brawls, and his reserves were already fully deployed to plug the gaps. The execution squad cut down any soldier who attempted to flee. Retreat meant the total collapse of the front and the end of Heavenham. "My lord, Charlotte's position is failing. She's too far forward," an aide shouted. Boris saw the danger. Charlotte's guards were nearly gone, and her individual prowess was reaching its limit. Her movements slowed as her armor took more damage, and the fiercest bandits swarmed her, sensing a chance to claim the head of a knight. Boris felt a surge of dread. If Charlotte fell, he would lose both a vital commander and face the wrath of Count Rochefort. "Wait," he growled, eyes fixed on the banner of Gustav, the protector of the realm. He gambled that Gustav would grow impatient and commit his final reserves to finish the job. "My lord, we must attack. The left flank is collapsing," the aide urged. Boris refused to move, waiting like a hunter for the enemy to expose their throat. A scout arrived, breathless. "My lord, Gustav's main elite force of 3,000 is moving toward our left flank." Boris's eyes lit up. The trap was sprung. "Order Friedrich to strike. Target their elite force and cut them in half," Boris commanded. Messengers raced toward the hills to deliver the order. Simultaneously, the situation on the left flank turned dire as Gustav's elites swarmed Charlotte's dwindling circle. "Protect the lady." Her last two guards were run through by spears, and a heavy mace swung toward Charlotte's arm. Clang! The impact shattered her defenses, sending a jolt of paralyzing pain through her right arm. Her sword slipped from her numb fingers and fell into the mud. The world went silent, save for the thundering of her heart and the agony in her arm. She stumbled back, using her battered shield to deflect blows as spears scraped against her armor. Despair washed over her, and her vision blurred, replaced by the image of Klein in his cradle, reaching out with innocent, chubby hands. Tears mixed with blood as she mourned the future she would never see, the birthdays, the lessons, the man he would become. "I'm sorry, Klein. I'm breaking my promise." My image followed, haunting her final moments. "Where are you? Are you safe? If only you were here. Your sword is steadier, your shoulders stronger. Alas, we cannot even meet one last time." Regret coiled around her throat like icy vines, stifling her breath. The surrounding bandits howled in triumph. A burly leader, spotting her faltering stance, swung a stolen spear, smashing it into the joint of her left leg armor. Bang! Charlotte groaned as her knee buckled, forcing her to one knee in the blood-soaked mud. Her heavy armor, once her protection, now pinned her down. Gasping, she braced her left arm, her right arm hanging limp. Her vision darkened, and the only sound was her own ragged, desperate breathing. It was over. Her fading eyes reflected a bandit grinning as he raised a blood-stained battle axe, its edge catching the dim, cold light. Time seemed to freeze. She saw every cruel wrinkle on his face, heard his guttural roar, and felt the suffocating wind of the descending axe. She closed her eyes, feeling no fear, only exhaustion and a deep, aching longing for her distant kin. A faint, bitter smile touched her lips, a final mockery of fate and a solace for having fought to the end. Yet, the expected agony of death never came. Instead, a dull, wet thud echoed, followed by a choked scream from above her. Then, the earth trembled under the thunderous charge of hundreds of heavy cavalry. Charlotte snapped her eyes open. The bandit with the axe hung suspended in midair, a knight's spear run through his chest, his body tossed aside like a rag doll. The attacker, a knight encased in pitch-black plate armor, thundered past her on a massive warhorse, his spear still leveled. The wind of his passage whipped her blood-matted hair. She glimpsed the grim family crest on his armor and felt the raw, hot power of his charging steed. Time stood still. Then, a torrent of black iron surged from behind her. The very lines that had seemed lost now erupted with destructive force. Boom! The earth groaned. Hundreds of heavy cavalry, in a wedge formation, smashed into the bandits' exposed flank like a red-hot iron chisel. Friedrich led the charge, followed by hussars wielding sabers, axes, and flails. The steel tide collided with the forest of flesh. Spears skewered, sabers carved, and iron hooves crushed the enemy into the mud. The battlefield erupted in a cacophony of screams and breaking bones, the sound of a total collapse. The bandit elite, moments ago on the verge of victory, were stunned by the unexpected, devastating strike. Their momentum shattered. Confusion spread like a plague as they were trampled by the iron cavalry. Heavy cavalry. It's an ambush. Run. The collapse was total. The bandits fled, colliding with their own reinforcements, while their officers were cut down. The core of their 10,000-strong army disintegrated under the precision of the backstab. Charlotte knelt in the blood, watching the tide turn. The black iron force reaped the enemy like wheat. Saved, have we won? A mix of relief, shock, and joy flooded her. She tried to rise, to grab her sword and join the pursuit. But her body had reached its limit. With the adrenaline gone, overwhelming exhaustion and pain crashed down on her. Her limbs failed her. As she tried to push herself up, the world turned black, and she collapsed forward. The cold, bloody mud felt strangely peaceful. As the sounds of battle faded, the faint smile on her lips deepened, a glimmer of light through the storm. One, Klein. Heavenum is safe. Darkness gently swallowed her consciousness. Her mind drifted upward from the depths, pulled toward the surface of light and sound. As Charlotte's eyelids fluttered open, she saw the comforting beige of a linen-tint ceiling in the morning light. No smoke, no blood, only the scent of herbs and clean linen. The soreness and bandages confirmed that her ordeal was real. She turned her head to see a tall figure standing at the tent entrance. The dust-stained armor and unruly brown hair were unmistakable. Friedrich, she rasped, her voice barely audible. He spun around, his weary face lighting up with relief as he rushed to her bedside. Charlotte, you're awake. Thank the gods. He leaned in, his sharp gray eyes filled with genuine, profound concern. Charlotte tried to move, but winced in pain. Friedrich noticed and carefully propped her up, offering a water skin. After a sip, she anxiously asked, "The battle, did we win?" She stared at Friedrich, fearing the worst. Friedrich's expression dimmed. He looked away, brow furrowed, his shoulders slumping as if struggling to find the words. The air in the tent grew heavy. Charlotte's heart sank. Had the cavalry charge failed? Was all their bloodshed in vain? Her breath hitched as she gripped the rough bedsheets until her knuckles turned white. Friedrich's voice was low and heavy. What happened? Charlotte pressed, her voice trembling. Suddenly, the corners of Friedrich's mouth curled upward. His somber mask melted away, replaced by a bright, mischievous grin. A total victory, he declared gleefully. Gustav's army is shattered, his supplies seized. That self-proclaimed protector of the realm has lost his head. It's already en route to the royal capital as a gift for the Queen Mother. Stunned, Charlotte flushed with a mix of anger and embarrassment. You, she stammered, wanting to strike him but wincing as her wounds flared. Friedrich, I was so worried, and you were just joking. Seeing her pale face flush with indignation and her blue eyes shimmering, Friedrich felt his heart skip a beat. He raised his hands in surrender, still smiling. My fault. You looked so serious, I couldn't help it. But it's good to see you so spirited. The levity passed. Charlotte grew serious. What's next? Do we rest or? Friedrich's smile vanished, replaced by a grave expression. The situation is dire. The Queen Mother has ordered all available forces to march north immediately to relieve Eglinist. Eglinist? Charlotte's heart tightened. She knew it was under siege, but not that it was so critical. The Solonians have besieged it for 3 months. Count Eisenberg is in trouble, Friedrich said grimly. We must break the siege or help him break out before the city falls. Charlotte sighed. A troubled time indeed. Internal rebellion was over, But the Solonians remained a grave threat. Who else is being mobilized? She asked. Many, Friedrich listed. Your father, Count Rockefort, is approaching from the northwest. My father, Duke Schmidt, and my brother, I, have just quelled the rebellion in field territory and are marching north. The capital garrison and others are joining too. The Queen Mother is preparing for a decisive battle. At the mention of I, Charlotte's body trembled slightly. She lowered her eyes, hiding her complex emotions. I had quelled the rebellion. I was going to Iglanus too? Fine, Charlotte said, her gaze hardening with resolve. I'm going. The Rhineland Legion needs rest, but I can take those fit for duty. No, Friedrich interrupted firmly. You're injured, blood loss, soft tissue damage, a fractured arm. You need rest. This will be a brutal campaign. You aren't fit for it. They're just flesh wounds, she argued, trying to sit up, only to gasp in pain. See, Friedrich pressed her shoulder gently. Listen to me. Your legion has already done its part. Your task now is to recover. I must go, Charlotte insisted, her blue eyes piercing. You don't understand. I have my reasons. The reason was unspoken. She missed me and needed to see me. Seeing her iron will, Friedrich sighed. Fine, but you wait until you're stable. You travel with the logistics train, no front lines. That's my condition, or I'll keep you confined to this tent. Charlotte nodded. I agree, but I leave as soon as possible. Friedrich helped her out of the tent. The sun was blinding. Nearby, the army was clearing the battlefield, the atmosphere one of weary triumph. A carriage with thick blankets awaited. As she boarded, her pale face looked ethereal in the sunlight, her golden hair messy, her blue eyes clear and resolute. She possessed a haunting, unique charm. Take care, Friedrich. See you at Iglanist. See you there. Travel safely. Friedrich watched the carriage depart toward Heavenham. He stood motionless long after the carriage vanished into the dust. Her final glance, that pale yet stubborn face, remained branded in his mind. He had seen many beauties, but none like Charlotte. Her beauty transcended features. It was the radiance of a warrior combined with a natural, feminine grace. Most captivating was her paradoxical, maternal gentleness, a trait so unexpected in a battle-hardened female knight, yet lethally attractive. A powerful thought took root. He wanted to conquer her. Not a territory or a title, but this unique, resilient, and mysterious soul. Meanwhile, at Golden Scale Port in field territory, the 3-month siege reached its endgame. The once prosperous port was a ruin. Its walls collapsed and streets reduced to smoldering ash. Duke Schmidt's heavy artillery bombarded the city day and night, crushing the defenders' morale and depleting their supplies. Hunger and disease spread like a plague. Luoyao and Fadis stood on the governor's mansion balcony, watching the vast enemy camp and the Schmidt/Conford warships blockading the harbor, their faces gray with despair. 5 days of food left. No gunpowder. No medicine, Fadis said, his voice hollow with regret. He had hoped to gain power by betraying the port to Luoyao, but the Schmidt family's methodical, cruel blockade had strangled them. With no skilled sailors or gunners, their makeshift ships stood no chance against the professional fleet blockading the sea. No more waiting, Luoyao rasped, his eyes bloodshot. 3 months of despair had stripped away his humanity, leaving only a beast's instinct for survival. Tonight, we abandon the city. Gather every seaworthy vessel and every man who can hold a weapon. We break out by water under cover of darkness, northward, to defect to the Solonians. It was my only remaining path. Land was a dead end. Only the sea offered a slim chance to bypass the blockade. Being a dog for the Solonians was better than dying here. But Duke Schmidt and I had anticipated this. That night, as Luoyao and Fadis led their remaining 2,000 men, many of them coerced civilians, onto a ragtag fleet, a trap was already waiting. Enemy ships departing, heading north-northeast. All fleets, hoist the battle flags. Intercept as planned. Werner and Klein, eager to prove their worth to Conford, were ready and waiting. As orders rang out, the Conford and Schmidt fleets closed in like sharks, their lanterns and torches lighting up the sea like a wall of stars. It was a mismatch, a disorganized, demoralized rabble against a well-rested, professional naval force. The outcome was certain. Fire. Naval cannons roared, tearing through the night. A large vessel was struck at the waterline and began to sink, its crew jumping into the freezing sea amidst screams. Other ships were set ablaze or crippled. Board them. Leave no one alive. Werner roared, brandishing his scimitar from the flagship, desperate for a decisive victory to cement his status. Klein commanded a secondary squadron, skillfully segmenting the fleeing enemy and picking them off with broadside fire and boarding actions. The battle turned into a slaughter. Werner and Klein fought like gods of war, their ferocity shattering the rebels' will to resist. Most were cut down or leaped overboard in terror. Phaetus was run through the throat by Klein, ending his life of betrayal and ambition in a pool of blood. Watching his last loyalists fall and his ships burn, Luoyao was consumed by despair. He seized a small skiff and rowed into the darkness with a dozen survivors, ignoring the Hell's Cape behind him. The carnage marked the final requiem for the rebellion at Golden Scale Port. By dawn, the battle was over. The rebel fleet was annihilated, and Golden Scale Port was finally reclaimed.